I had been planning that camping trip for weeks, maybe months if I was honest with myself. Work had been eating me alive, and I needed to get away from everything. The city noise, the endless screens, the people. I wanted silence, space, trees, and the kind of quiet that feels heavy in your ears. I picked a spot that wasn't on the usual camping maps. Just a piece of forest land I found after tracing an old trail on a topographic chart. It was far enough from the usual campsites that I figured I'd have it all to myself, but still within reach of a dirt access road so I could get there with my pack, without losing half the day. I left early in the morning, driving through empty stretches of highway until the city fell behind me. The landscape slowly shifted from suburbs and gas stations to open farmland, then to long lines of pine trees crowding the roadside. I had my gear in the trunk, packed heavier than I probably needed. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, food for 3 days, water filter, first aid kit, a survival knife, and even a small hatchet. It was the kind of loadout someone takes when they expect nothing, but want to be prepared for everything. I kept telling myself it was just a relaxing solo trip, but I think a part of me always prepared for things to go wrong. The dirt road that led to the spot was rough and narrow, with branches brushing against the side of my car. When I finally parked, there was no one else around, not even signs that anyone had been there in a long time. The trees pressed in close, tall and dark, the ground littered with needles and fallen branches. The air had that damp forest smell, earthy and heavy like soil and moss that never see full sunlight. I shouldered my pack and started in. The trail wasn't much of a trail, just a faint line between the trees that looked more like an animal path than anything made by people. My boots sank into soft dirt and every step snapped twigs or shifted leaves. The silence was so deep that each sound I made felt wrong, too loud, like I was disturbing something that didn't want to be disturbed. It took me about an hour to reach the spot I had marked. A small clearing opened up in the trees, flat enough to set a tent on. The ground there was dry, with enough space for a fire pit, though I had no plans to light one yet. I dropped my pack, stretched my shoulders, and listened. Nothing but the wind moving high above in the treetops. No birds, no insects. That struck me right away. Normally you'd hear some life out there, but this place seemed strangely hollow. I set up camp slowly, careful with each step. The tent went up without trouble, staked into the earth. I laid out the sleeping bag inside, set up my stove on a flat rock, and filtered some water from a small stream that ran just beyond the clearing. The water was cold, metallic, and it left my hands numb. The first few hours passed quietly. I ate a small meal, walked a short distance just to get my bearings, and returned before it got dark. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, I already felt uneasy. The forest grew darker faster than I expected. The shadows bled into one another until the clearing seemed like an island in a sea of black. I had a headlamp, but I used it sparingly, not wanting to draw too much attention. Attention from what I didn't know, but the thought kept pressing on me. That night I lay in my sleeping bag listening. The forest stayed silent. No crickets, no frogs, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The only sound was the wind moving faintly, and every now and then something heavier, a branch snapping far off, a dull thump like something large shifting its weight. Each sound sent a prickling sensation through my skin. I kept telling myself it was just deer, maybe elk, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching. When I finally drifted into a light, restless sleep, I woke several times to faint noises. Once it was the sound of movement circling the clearing just outside the reach of the tent. The crack of twigs, deliberate and slow. Another time it was a sudden rush through the brush, quick and heavy, then gone. I lay frozen, gripping the handle of the knife I had tucked beside me. My breathing felt too loud, echoing in the fabric of the tent. Morning came gray and cold. My body ached from the bad sleep and my nerves were still raw. I made coffee on the stove, the smell familiar and grounding, but I couldn't shake the unease. I walked around the clearing, checking for tracks, and that's when I saw them. Not animal prints, boots. Human boots. The tread marks were faint but clear in the soft dirt near the stream. Someone else had been close, maybe during the night. They weren't mine. I knew exactly where I had walked the day before, and these were different. Heavier, wider, and leading into the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring at the prints. My first thought was to pack up and leave, but I forced myself to calm down. It could have been an old set of tracks left days ago, maybe even weeks. The forest floor holds signs longer than you think if the weather doesn't clear them away. Still, the thought gnawed at me. I decided to stay another night, partly out of stubbornness, partly because I didn't want to feel like I had been chased away by nothing more than my imagination. I spent the day hiking short loops around camp, keeping careful note of my path. I never saw anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being shadowed. Once I stopped to drink from my bottle and thought I heard a footstep behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing. That second night was worse. I tried to sleep but kept jolting awake. The noises returned, this time closer, clearer. The sound of someone moving just outside the tent, slow and steady like they were circling again. I held my breath, gripping the knife so hard my hand cramped. I thought about unzipping the tent and shining my headlamp, but fear pinned me down. If someone was out there, shining a light would only show them exactly where I was, and I was already exposed enough. The circling went on for what felt like hours, then stopped suddenly. The silence that followed was even worse. I couldn't tell if they had left or if they were standing just beyond the fabric waiting. When dawn broke, I crawled out of the tent, my body trembling from exhaustion. I walked the edge of the clearing, scanning the dirt, and there they were again. Prints. Fresh ones. They circled my camp in a wide loop. Someone had walked around my tent while I was inside. My chest tightened as I stared at them. There was no pretending now. Someone was out here with me. I packed faster than I ever had in my life. My hands shook as I tore down the tent and stuffed everything into my pack. I didn't even bother eating. I just wanted to be gone. The trail back to my car felt longer than before. Each step a strain under the weight of the pack and the weight of the fear pressing in. Halfway back, I noticed something that froze me in place. Another set of prints, fresh and clear, pressed into the soft dirt of the trail ahead of me. They weren't mine. They weren't from yesterday. They were from that morning. Whoever it was had been walking the same way I was headed. Not away from me, but ahead, like they knew I would come this way. I wanted to turn and run in the opposite direction, but the forest was too dense, and I had no idea where else the road might be. My only choice was forward, so I kept moving, slower now, my ears straining for any sound. The prints led all the way back to the road. My car sat where I had left it, untouched from the outside, but something felt wrong. I stopped short, crouching low, scanning everything. The silence pressed down heavy again. That's when I saw it. A small strip of fabric torn and caught on the trunk latch. Not mine. A dull brown piece frayed at the edges, clinging there like someone had brushed against it while checking the car. My throat tightened. I yanked the door open, threw my pack inside, and started the engine. I didn't care about the gear, about food, about anything but getting out. The tires spun in the dirt before catching, and I shot down the road, branches scraping the paint as I sped away. Even as the trees fell behind me and the highway came into view, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. Whoever had been out there hadn't tried to speak, hadn't revealed themselves. They had only watched, circled, followed. The silence of the forest hadn't been empty at all. It had been waiting. I didn't stop until I was miles from the forest, the sun climbing high, the world returning to normal. But even now, when I think about it, I remember the sound of footsteps in the dirt, slow and patient, circling me in the dark. And I know I wasn't alone out there. I never used to think twice about going into the woods alone. The idea of camping in the middle of nowhere was something that gave me peace more than fear. I liked the quiet, the way the trees muffled the noise of the outside world, the way the night stretched long and still. But when I think back now, I realize how blind I was to the risks that were always there waiting. The trip that changed everything for me started like any other, with a half-packed bag and the thought that I needed a break from everything. I had been working too much, sleeping too little, and eating in a way that barely passed for meals. I told myself a few nights in the woods would clear my head. Just me, the air, and the sound of running water somewhere nearby. I wanted to pick a place random this time, somewhere I hadn't researched to death, somewhere that didn't have reviews or photos to spoil the unknown. So I picked a spot on the map, a thick patch of green without any trails marked on it, and I drove until the road turned to dirt, then to gravel, then to nothing at all. I parked my truck by a gap between the trees, slung my pack over my shoulders and stepped in. It was late afternoon when I started walking, the sun still giving off a dull gold light that bled between the leaves. The woods smelled damp, earthy, alive. Every step sank into soft ground. The deeper I went, the less I thought about where I had come from. I walked for over an hour before I found the clearing. It wasn't large, just enough space where the grass pushed through between tree roots, open enough to set up my small tent. A fallen log sat on one side, moss-covered, and in the middle of the clearing was a circle of stones that looked like maybe someone else had used it before for a fire. That felt good to me. If someone else had camped there once, it meant it wasn't a bad spot. I set my tent up carefully, making sure the ground underneath was flat. Then I gathered what dry sticks I could find and made a small fire pit, stacking the wood neatly. It was still too light out to light it, so I sat on the log and let my eyes trace the trees around me. The forest was quiet but not empty. I could hear birds further away, some rustling in the leaves, and the faint hum of insects close by. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel safe at first. By the time the sun dropped lower, I had my fire going. The smoke rose slow and straight. I heated a can of beans, ate them straight from the metal, and leaned back against the log. The heat of the flames kept the chill back, and for a while everything felt perfect. The stars started to show through gaps in the branches, but even that first night I had the sense something was wrong. It wasn't clear or sharp, just a tightness in my chest that made me look over my shoulder more than I normally would. The fire threw shadows across the clearing, and sometimes I thought they moved wrong, like something was standing just outside the light. I told myself it was my own nerves, that my mind was playing tricks because I had picked a spot at random, and that meant I didn't have the usual comfort of knowing what was around me. I crawled into the tent later than I usually would, zipped the door shut, and tried to sleep. But I woke up again and again, my ears pulling me out of dreams I couldn't remember. Once it was the sound of snapping twigs. Another time it was something heavier, like a footstep. Each time I sat up, held my breath, listened until I couldn't hear anything at all, then lay back down. The tent felt too thin, like one push could tear it open. When morning finally came, I felt like I had barely rested, but the light made the fear from the night seem foolish. I told myself I was just out of practice, that camping alone after so long would naturally make me jumpy. I boiled water for coffee, ate a granola bar, and set out to explore. I didn't go far, only about a mile from camp, but the forest seemed endless. The deeper I walked, the more I noticed things that didn't fit. Trees marked with deep cuts as if a blade had been taken to them, a rusted can crushed flat against the dirt. At one point I found an old rope tied high around a branch, frayed and dangling. It looked weathered, like it had been there for years, but seeing it hanging there in the stillness unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. By midday, I was back at my camp. I made another fire, cooked some noodles, and sat for a long time just staring at the flames. The unease from the night before never really left me. Every so often I thought I heard something far off, a crack, a shift in the branches. But whenever I stood and scanned the trees, there was nothing there. The second night was worse. The air felt colder, heavier, even though the day had been warm. I built the fire higher than before, thinking it would keep whatever was out there away. The sound started earlier this time, before I even climbed into the tent. I was sitting on the log when I heard what I can only describe as someone walking through the brush. The steps were slow, uneven, but heavy. I froze, staring into the dark, my fire popping and snapping beside me. The sound stopped just before I convinced myself to grab my flashlight. I sat there, heart pounding, until my legs ached from not moving. Eventually, I forced myself into the tent, zipped it shut, and lay with my flashlight in hand. I didn't sleep at all. I couldn't. At some point in the night, I heard the sound again. This time closer, leaves crunching, then stopping, then starting again, circling. I could feel the weight of it even through the thin nylon walls. The presence of someone or something walking just outside, pacing. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Hours passed that way, with my eyes wide open and my ears straining at every sound. When morning came, the fire was dead. Nothing but cold ash. My tent was still zipped, but I noticed something that made my stomach sink. Around the clearing in the dirt were fresh prints. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet, large, wider than mine, pressed deep into the soft ground. They circled the clearing, weaving between trees, stopping near the log, then near the tent, then around the fire pit. I stared at them for a long time, my mind refusing to process what it meant. Someone had been there, not an animal, a person, walking barefoot in the dark, circling me as I lay inside my tent. The idea of packing up and leaving hit me, but I forced it down. Maybe it was a hiker, maybe someone lost, maybe. I tried to make excuses, but the more I looked at those prints, the less sense they made. No bag marks, no clothes dropped, just bare feet moving around in circles. I stayed through the day because I told myself I wasn't going to run from shadows. I built up the fire again, gathered more wood than before, and tried to make myself feel like I was in control. But as the sun dropped, the dread came back stronger. I knew it would happen again. That night, it did. It started with silence. No birds, no insects, nothing. The forest went still in a way that made my skin crawl. Then came the first step. A slow, dragging sound in the dirt. Then another. Then another. This time there was no mistaking it. Whoever it was, they were walking right into the clearing. I gripped the flashlight and waited. The steps came closer until they were right outside my tent. I could see the faint shadow of movement against the fabric, tall, broad. They stopped for a long time. I could hear breathing, slow, steady. Just outside. I don't know how long it lasted, maybe minutes, maybe hours. My muscles ached from holding still, from gripping the flashlight so hard my fingers went numb. At some point I realized the zipper of the tent was moving, just slightly, like fingers brushing against it. Testing it, I snapped. I shouted, a sound that tore my throat raw, and slammed my hand against the side of the tent. There was a pause, then the steps retreated. Not fast, not in a run, just slow, steady. Like whoever it was didn't feel the need to hurry. When the sun came up, the prints were deeper. More of them. Leading out of the clearing this time, disappearing into the trees. That morning, I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands shook as I shoved gear into the bag. The tent half folded, the fire pit still warm. I didn't care about neatness, I just wanted to leave. But the forest didn't make it easy. The way back didn't look the same. Paths twisted, landmarks shifted. More than once I found myself circling back to the same spot. Hours passed, sweat soaking through my shirt, my throat dry, and then I saw it. Another clearing. Not mine, a different one. In the center was a collapsed tent, sun-bleached and torn. Around it scattered belongings, rusted cans, clothes half buried in dirt. And circling all of it, the same barefoot prints pressed deep, overlapping, fresh. I didn't go closer. I didn't want to know more. I turned and forced myself to keep moving, pushing through brush, scraping my arms and legs. The sense of being watched never left me. The feeling of footsteps always just behind, always waiting for me to stop. It took the rest of the day. But finally I stumbled back onto the gravel road. My truck sat where I had left it, sun glaring off the windshield. My legs nearly gave out when I reached it. I threw my bag inside, started the engine, and drove without looking back. Even now I don't know who or what it was. I only know what I saw. The prints, the shadow outside my tent, the slow breathing in the dark. I know someone was out there circling me, waiting. And I know I'll never set foot in the woods alone again. I had camped many times before, but this trip was different from the others. I decided to go somewhere quiet, away from the busy spots where people usually set up tents near the lakes or the easy trails. I wanted to be alone, completely alone, deep in the woods where the only sounds would be the wind, the trees, and maybe the distant call of an animal. It was something I had thought about for months, and when I finally had the time, I packed up my gear and went for it. The drive out was long. I remember the sun was already leaning down toward the horizon when I reached the last stretch of dirt road. The forest there was thick with tall pines and a dense undergrowth that looked untouched. The road itself was more like two faded tire tracks, grass and weeds growing up the middle. I parked my car in a small clearing at the side of the road and shut it off. For a moment I just sat there, letting the silence swallow me. No traffic, no houses, no voices. Just the faint ticking sound of the car engine cooling down. I loaded my backpack carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, cooking gear, knife, flashlight, food sealed in plastic, and a couple bottles of water. I planned to refill from streams if I found any, using a filter I carried. My plan was to hike in a few miles, far enough that no one passing by on the road would see me. That's where I'd set up camp. The trail was barely visible. It wasn't marked, but there were faint signs of people having walked through at some point. Maybe hunters or other campers from years ago. I followed it, moving steadily, my boots crunching on dry leaves. The deeper I went, the darker it seemed, even though it was still daylight. The trees were so close together they blocked out much of the sky, and only thin lines of sun broke through. After maybe an hour and a half of walking, I found a spot that felt right. It was a flat piece of ground surrounded by thick brush on 3 sides, and a slope that led down to a narrow stream about 100 yards away. The sound of the water carried faintly to where I stood. I thought it was perfect, quiet, hidden, and far enough in that I doubted anyone would stumble across it. I set up my tent carefully, hammering the stakes into the ground and stretching the rainfly tight. The forest around me felt alive but calm. Every now and then I heard the rustle of something small moving in the leaves, maybe a squirrel or a bird dropping down. I got a small fire going, not too big, just enough to cook on and give some warmth. I made a simple meal, sat on a fallen log and ate while the sun dropped lower and lower. By the time darkness came, the fire was all I had. The woods turned black almost instantly, as if someone had pulled a heavy curtain around me. I switched on my flashlight once, shining it around, and the beam cut across the trees, showing only endless trunks and branches that seemed to swallow the light. I clicked it back off, sat close to the fire, and told myself that this was exactly what I wanted. Peace, quiet, and no one around. But the quiet began to change as night deepened. The normal sounds of a forest, the insects, the occasional bird call, faded out until there was almost nothing. I noticed it slowly, and once I did, it became impossible to ignore. It was like everything had gone still at the same time. I sat there listening harder, straining to pick out even the smallest sound, and found only silence. The fire cracked, and I flinched. I felt my chest tighten, the kind of tightness that comes when your mind starts to wander into places it shouldn't. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to calm down. I told myself it was normal, that animals go quiet sometimes, that it was nothing to be afraid of. Still, the silence pressed against me like a weight. When I finally lay down inside the tent, I left the fire burning low outside. The glow seeped through the thin fabric enough that I could make out faint shapes inside. I pulled the sleeping bag over myself and tried to relax. My body was tired from the hike, but my mind wouldn't slow down. Every little sound outside, no matter how faint, seemed sharp and close. At some point, I must have drifted into a light sleep. I don't know how long it lasted before I woke again, heart pounding. I didn't know what had pulled me out of sleep, but I was fully awake in an instant. I lay perfectly still, eyes wide open, ears straining. That's when I heard it, the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. Slow, steady, deliberate. At first I thought maybe it was a deer, but deer move in a quicker, lighter way. This was different. Heavy. Careful. Like someone trying not to make noise, but failing because the ground was covered with leaves and twigs. The steps stopped. I lay frozen in my bag, every muscle tight. My mouth was dry and my chest rose and fell too quickly. I told myself to stay calm, to think. If it was another camper, maybe they had stumbled on my sight by mistake. But the way the footsteps moved, it didn't sound like wandering. It sounded like someone circling. I slowly slid my hand toward my backpack where I had tucked my knife. I didn't unzip it, didn't make a sound, just let my fingers rest there. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, but was probably only minutes. Finally, I heard the footsteps again, moving away this time, fading into the distance until there was nothing. I stayed awake until dawn, never closing my eyes again. The moment light broke through the trees, I got out of the tent and looked around. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, so it was hard to see anything clear. But I thought I could make out faint impressions of footprints near the edge of the clearing. They weren't animal tracks. They looked human. I told myself maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was old tracks, maybe anything. I tried to shake it off, cooked breakfast, and went to refill my bottles at the stream. The water was cold and clear, and for a moment, the normalcy of it calmed me. But that night it happened again. This time I didn't even manage to sleep first. I sat by the dying fire, and when the woods went quiet again, I knew something was wrong. The same heavy, careful steps returned, this time from the other side of the clearing. I held my breath, staring at the dark beyond the firelight, but nothing appeared. The steps circled again, closer this time. Then stopping, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood, grabbed the flashlight, and shined it into the trees. The beam swept across trunks and brush, shadows leaping, but I saw nothing. No movement, no shape of a person or animal, just endless forest. I shut the light off quickly, realizing I might have given away my exact position more clearly. I backed into the tent and zipped it closed, clutching the knife now in my hand. Again, the steps moved off, fading until I couldn't hear them anymore. The second morning, I was done pretending. I packed my gear quickly, stuffing everything back into my backpack. My plan had been to stay 3 or 4 days, but I couldn't imagine another night out there. I needed to leave. But when I reached the trail, I froze. On the ground, right where the faint path led back toward the road, there were fresh footprints. Large, clear, and heading in the direction of my camp. They hadn't been there yesterday. Whoever had been walking at night had been following the same trail. The hike back felt endless. Every few minutes I turned, scanning behind me, certain I would see someone following. But the trail stayed empty. Still, the feeling of being watched never left. My skin prickled and my stomach twisted. When I finally saw my car in the clearing, relief washed over me. I hurried to it, dropped my pack in the back, and slid into the driver's seat. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition and started it up. I didn't even glance around as I pulled onto the dirt road. But just before the forest swallowed the clearing behind me, I made the mistake of looking into the rearview mirror. On the edge of the trees, half hidden in shadow, was the shape of a man, standing perfectly still, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until the dirt road turned to gravel, then to pavement, then until I saw other cars again. I never went back to that area, and even now, years later, I still think about it sometimes. The way the footsteps circled me, the silence in the woods, the fresh prints on the trail, and the man, standing there waiting as if the only mistake I had made was leaving too soon. I remember the exact day I decided to go out alone. The air had cooled after weeks of late summer heat, and I thought a solo camping trip would clear my head. I picked a random spot on the map, a place deep in the woods that I had never been before. It wasn't part of any big park or popular trail. It was just a patch of forest land, miles away from the nearest small town, and it looked quiet. That was what I wanted. Quiet, isolation, no people, just me and the trees. I loaded up my backpack with food, water, a tent, a sleeping bag, a small camp stove, a knife, a flashlight, and a few extra batteries. I told myself I would be careful, that I would mark the way in, and that I would only stay for 2 nights. The drive took almost 3 hours. The further I went, the fewer houses I saw. The last stretch was on a rough dirt road that was nearly hidden by overgrown grass. My car bumped along until the path ended at a clearing big enough to park. I left it there and checked my backpack straps. The sun was high and the forest seemed still, almost heavy, as if the trees had been holding their breath for years. The first mile or so was easy. The ground was dry. Leaves crunched under my boots and birds called from the branches above. I kept my phone in my pocket but knew I had no signal. I tried to pay attention to everything around me, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to memorize it. I told myself I would notice small things, broken branches, rocks shaped in a certain way, the slope of the ground, so I wouldn't lose my way. After about an hour of walking, I found a spot that seemed good enough to set up camp. It was a small clearing with just enough space for my tent, surrounded by tall pines. The ground was flat and soft with pine needles, and there was no sign that anyone had camped there before. That made me feel proud, like I had claimed a place all for myself. I set up the tent and unrolled my sleeping bag inside. I boiled some water on the little stove, made a packet of soup, and sat on a fallen log while eating. The soup was bland, but it felt good to hold something hot in my hands as the shadows started to stretch. I listened to the forest as it shifted from day to night. Birds went quiet and crickets began to chirp. Every now and then I thought I heard movement in the underbrush, but it was faint, like something small. I told myself it was rabbits or squirrels. That first night was colder than I expected. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the tent fabric move with the wind. I thought I heard steps outside once, faint and slow, like someone brushing against the pine needles. My body tensed and I held my breath until it stopped. I tried to explain it away, maybe a deer, maybe the trees creaking. I didn't sleep much, just drifted in and out until the gray light of morning seeped through the tent. The next day I wanted to explore further. I packed a small bag with water and snacks and left my main gear at the camp. I walked deeper into the woods without following any clear trail. The ground sloped downhill into thicker brush. The air felt heavier there, damp and still. I noticed fewer sounds, no bird calls, only the faint hum of insects. I moved slowly, marking my path with broken sticks and scratched bark. After maybe an hour, I found a dry creek bed. It looked old, the kind that only filled with water during heavy rain. The rocks there were sharp and jagged, and the space between the banks was wide enough to make me think it had once been a strong stream. I crouched down, ran my hand over the stones, and felt how cold they were even in daylight. The silence made me uneasy. It was so complete that I could hear my own breathing echo back at me. I stood up and looked around. That was when I noticed something strange. About 30 yards upstream, near a bend in the dry creek, there were logs stacked together. At first I thought it was natural, but the logs were too straight, placed too neatly, like someone had dragged them there. It didn't look like a shelter exactly, but more like a half-finished wall. I walked closer, my boots crunching against the dry stones. The logs were heavy, stripped of most branches, stacked in an uneven pile. They weren't old either. The bark was fresh, sap still sticky in places. Whoever had put them there had done so recently. I didn't see any footprints, though. The ground was too hard to hold prints well, but still, I expected something. I stood there for a while, staring at the logs, feeling the weight of the woods pressing in. My stomach tightened. I told myself people came out here sometimes. Maybe hunters, maybe someone trying to build something. But it bothered me that it was in such a hidden place down in that creek bed where no one would easily find it. I backed away and decided to return to camp. I didn't want to stay long around that spot. On the way back, I tried to follow my markers, but more than once I turned in a circle, confused. The woods looked the same in every direction. It took me much longer than I expected to find the clearing again. When I did, I felt a wave of relief. My tent was still there, untouched. The stove and bag just where I left them. That second night, I built a small fire. The flames gave me comfort, though the crackling seemed louder than it should have been. I kept replaying the image of those stacked logs in my head. It didn't feel right. I kept glancing into the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. The fire burned low and I let it die out before going inside the tent. The air was colder that night, my breath fogging in the dim light. I woke to a sound. It was faint but sharp, like wood snapping. I sat up in the sleeping bag, heart pounding. The forest outside was black, no moonlight slipping through the trees. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate. I thought about unzipping the tent, shining my flashlight outside, but my body froze. I waited, listening. After a long stretch, the sound stopped. I forced myself to lie back down, though every muscle stayed tense until exhaustion dragged me into shallow sleep. When morning came, I stepped outside and scanned the clearing. Everything looked the same at first. Then I noticed something. On the far edge of the clearing, near the trees, the ground was disturbed. The pine needles there had been moved aside, the soil dark and fresh. It looked like someone had crouched there or pressed their weight into the ground. My stomach twisted. I told myself I was imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I thought about leaving early, but I forced myself to stay. I didn't want fear to chase me away. I decided to pack lightly and go back to the creek to see if the logs looked any different in daylight. The walk there felt longer than before. The woods seemed thicker, the air colder. When I reached the creek bed, my stomach dropped. The logs had been moved. They were stacked higher now, arranged into more of a wall with gaps between them closed. It was no half-finished thing anymore. Someone was building there and they were still doing it. I felt a chill move through me and suddenly I didn't want to be there. I turned back quickly, following my markers with more urgency this time. When I reached camp, I packed everything. My hands shook as I stuffed the sleeping bag, rolled the tent and strapped it all tight. I knew I had to leave. But as I started back toward where I thought my car was, the forest closed in around me. The markers I had made seemed harder to find, almost erased. I walked for what felt like hours, the sun sinking low, until I realized I was lost. I stopped, breathing hard, my backpack heavy against my shoulders. I turned in circles, searching for anything familiar. The woods looked endless, the same trees repeating over and over. That night I had no fire. I set the tent quickly in a random spot, too tired to go further. I ate a handful of trail mix and drank the last of my water. My throat was dry and my stomach cramped with hunger, but fear overpowered both. I lay in the dark, every sound amplified. Branches snapping, leaves shifting, faint steps moving just beyond the fabric wall. When dawn came, I packed again and forced myself onward. Hours passed. My feet blistered, my legs heavy. The forest gave no sign of ending. I tried to walk in a straight line, but the ground pulled me sideways, and soon I wasn't sure if I was going deeper or closer to the road. Then I saw it again, the dry creek bed. My chest tightened. Somehow I had circled back. I moved toward it carefully, my eyes scanning for the logs. They were there, higher now, built into something that looked almost like a blind, a barrier to hide behind. I froze. My skin crawled with the sense that someone had been there not long ago. The air was thick with silence. I didn't stay. I turned and ran, my backpack slamming against me, branches clawing at my arms and face. I ran until my lungs burned, until I collapsed against a tree. My body trembled and my ears rang with the sound of blood pounding. I stayed there, gasping, afraid to move until the sun dipped again. That final night I didn't set up the tent. I just sat with my back to a tree, clutching the knife, eyes wide in the dark. The woods pressed close, every sound sharp. At one point I thought I saw movement. A darker shape between the trees, but I refused to move. I stayed like that, rigid, until the faintest gray of morning appeared. When light came, I forced myself to walk. I stumbled, tripped, scraped my hands on row. I always thought camping was a way to clear my head. It was quiet, simple, and away from everything that usually filled my mind with noise. I had been working long hours and felt drained. So I decided to take a short trip out to a stretch of forest I had only read about online. It wasn't a tourist campground, not the type of place with signs, fire pits, and families in tents. It was raw land, miles of trees, brush, and dirt paths that faded out into nothing. I wanted that kind of solitude where the only sounds were wind, leaves, and water. I parked my car on the shoulder of a small gravel road that cut between hills. From there, I hiked in with my pack and supplies. I had brought everything: tent, sleeping bag, food sealed in containers, a water filter, a knife, flashlight, extra batteries, and a can of bear spray just in case. The trail was narrow, barely wide enough for one person to push through at times. Branches slapped against my arms as I walked, and the late afternoon sun came through in thin streaks that shifted as the wind moved the canopy. After about 2 hours of steady hiking, I found a spot near a small stream. The water wasn't deep, but it was clear enough to filter. The ground nearby was level, and there was a small patch without heavy brush where I could pitch my tent. It seemed perfect. I set everything up, rolled out my bag, and started to gather wood for a small fire. It was the kind of quiet I wanted. No cars, no people, no phone service, just the forest. As evening settled, the temperature dropped faster than I expected. The fire gave off some warmth, and I sat near it, eating from a container of rice and beans I had packed. I listened to the stream running and the wind passing through the trees. At first it was peaceful, but as it got darker, the forest took on a different feeling. Every sound seemed sharper, heavier. A twig snapping far away didn't sound like wood shifting under its own weight. It sounded like a footstep. Leaves rustling didn't sound like wind. It sounded like something moving slowly. I tried to shake it off. I had camped before, and the forest at night always played tricks on your head. Animals moved around, branches fell, owls called. I knew the logical explanations, but it didn't make my nerves settle. By the time I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and lay in my sleeping bag, I was hyper-aware of every little sound outside. Sleep came slow. I would close my eyes, drift, then snap awake at the sound of movement outside. Once I heard something splash in the shallow stream, like a foot stepping into the water. Another time I heard what sounded like steady crunches through the underbrush. Then silence, then another crunch. I held my breath, waiting, staring into the dark fabric of the tent. My flashlight was in my hand the entire time, ready to switch on. Sometime deep in the night I heard it again, but this time closer. It was deliberate, not random. Something moved near the tent, brushing against the nylon wall. I froze. My heartbeat was so loud I thought whoever or whatever was outside would hear it. The fabric pressed inward slightly, like a finger pushing at it, then slid away. I gripped the knife I had kept beside me and stayed completely still. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Eventually, the noises faded. I stayed awake until I saw the faint blue light of dawn glowing through the tent. Only then did I unzip the flap and step out. The forest looked different in daylight, softer and less threatening. But when I looked down at the dirt near my tent, my stomach dropped. There were footprints. Human footprints. They circled my tent, pressed into the soft ground. Some were half-washed by the stream's edge, but others were clear. Bare feet, not boots, not shoes. Someone had been walking around my tent barefoot in the middle of the night. I told myself it could have been an old camper, some tracks left days ago. But deep down I knew better. These were fresh. The soil was still damp where the impressions had been made. I packed up quickly. I wanted to leave, but something in me hesitated. The sun was up, and I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe someone else had wandered through. Maybe they were just passing by. Still, I couldn't stop looking at the tree line, scanning for any movement. I decided not to hike back right away. Instead, I stayed close, keeping busy. I boiled water from the stream, ate more food, and tried to calm down. By late afternoon, I convinced myself to give the night one more chance. It seemed cowardly to leave after one scare. I had come for solitude, and leaving now would feel like giving in to nerves. I gathered more wood and built a bigger fire that night. I sat up for hours, feeding the flames, staring into the shadows. My body felt wired, but eventually exhaustion hit me again. I let the fire burn low and crawled into my tent. This time I didn't fall asleep right away. I lay there listening, holding my flashlight, knife, and bear spray close. Hours passed in silence. Just when I thought I might actually rest, I heard it again. Footsteps. Soft, slow, circling. The footsteps stopped, and then something pressed against the tent wall, harder this time. Not a brush, but a hand, flat, pushing in. My chest tightened. I didn't move, but my grip on the knife and spray was so tight my knuckles ached. The hand slid down, then pulled away. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then I heard the faint sound of breathing, not mine. Outside the tent, inches away, steady breathing, I snapped. I yanked the zipper down, shoved the flap open, and shined the flashlight into the dark. For a split second, the beam caught a figure standing between the trees. A man. Thin, pale skin, long hair hanging over his face. No shirt, no shoes. He stood still, staring into the light. I stumbled out with the spray in one hand, knife in the other. But by the time my eyes adjusted, he was gone. The brush shook as something moved fast and disappeared deeper into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting by the fire I had built back up in a panic. Every few minutes I flashed the light into the trees, expecting to see him again. I never did. As soon as daylight broke, I packed everything. My hands shook as I shoved gear into my bag. I didn't care about order. I just needed to move. The hike back felt 10 times longer than the hike in. Every sound made me whip my head around. I was sure he was following me, staying just out of sight. When I reached my car, I threw my pack into the back seat and drove until I hit the main road, not stopping for anything. Only when I was miles away, surrounded by other cars and buildings, did I finally feel like I could breathe again. I didn't report it. What would I even say? A barefoot man was circling my tent in the woods. No one would take it seriously. Maybe he lived out there. Maybe he hunted people who wandered in. Maybe he just enjoyed scaring them. I don't know. But I do know I'll never camp alone again, because when you're in the woods at night, you don't really know who's out there with you. I had gone camping many times before, but that trip felt different from the start. I didn't plan it too carefully, which was unusual for me. Normally I'd research the trail, check maps, and mark my route, but that time I just grabbed my gear, stuffed some food into my pack, and drove out toward a state forest I had never been to before. It wasn't far from where I lived, maybe 3 hours, but it was big, with thick woods that stretched for miles. I thought it would be good to just lose myself out there for a while, away from everything. The drive was long and quiet. I stopped at a gas station before turning off onto a narrow road that cut through farmland, then gravel that wound deeper into the trees. There weren't many other cars around, just the occasional pickup. By the time I reached the parking area for the trail, the sun was already dropping lower than I expected. It worried me a little, but not enough to stop. I told myself I'd hike just an hour or so in, find a spot, and set up camp before dark. I strapped on my backpack, tightened my boots, and started down the path. The woods were silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the trees are swallowing up sound. Every crunch of my boots on the leaves seemed louder than it should have. I followed the trail markers, but they were spaced out far apart, and the trail itself wasn't well kept. At times it was just a faint line through the brush, easy to lose if I wasn't paying attention. After about 45 minutes, I came across a small clearing. It wasn't perfect, but it was flat enough for a tent. The trees around it were tall and crowded, their branches weaving together so thick that the last light of the sun barely filtered through. I dropped my pack and set up quickly. I didn't bother with a fire at first, just wanted to get the tent ready before it was too dark to see. By the time I finished, the woods were already dim. I gathered some fallen branches, struck a match, and built a small fire. The flames flickered weakly, casting shadows that stretched and bent across the clearing. I heated up a can of food and ate in silence. There was no cell service, so I couldn't check my phone for distractions. It was just me, the fire, and the endless stretch of trees pressing in on all sides. The first strange sound came not long after. It was faint, like a stick snapping, somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth, and listened. Nothing followed, just silence. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was close. That night I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the thin fabric of the tent roof above me. The fire had died down to embers. Outside, the forest was alive with little sounds, rustling, distant calls, the occasional thud of something moving in the undergrowth. At one point, I heard what sounded like deliberate steps, slow and steady, circling the edge of my camp. My body tensed, heart pounding in my ears. I wanted to believe it was a deer, but deer don't walk like that, not steady, not pacing. I lay still, barely breathing, waiting for it to pass. The steps came closer, then paused. I felt the weight of silence pressing in, heavier than before. Then, just as suddenly, the steps moved away, fading into the distance until there was nothing left but the regular sounds of the night. When morning came, I tried to laugh it off. I told myself I'd imagined it. Maybe I had dozed off and dreamed it. The fire pit was cold, my food untouched, nothing disturbed. Still, unease lingered in me. I packed a small bag and decided to hike further down the trail, leaving my tent behind for the day. The woods were thick and endless, the trail winding deeper into valleys and climbing ridges. Hours passed without me seeing another person. That was strange because the parking lot had several cars when I arrived. Where had all those people gone? I wondered if they had taken side trails or if they were deeper in the forest. By late afternoon, I headed back. The sun was low again, shadows stretching long across the ground. When I reached my campsite, something felt wrong. The air seemed heavier, as if the clearing had changed. I looked around carefully. My tent was still there, but the flap was open. I never left it open. I crouched down and peered inside. My sleeping bag had been dragged halfway out, dirt smeared across it. My backpack was unzipped, some of my things scattered on the ground. At first I thought maybe an animal had done it, but none of my food was touched. My knife, which I kept inside my pack, was lying on the ground outside the tent. That wasn't an animal. My stomach twisted. Someone had been there. I rebuilt the fire quickly, the shaking in my hands making it hard to light the match. The flames gave me some comfort, but not much. I couldn't stop glancing into the dark woods, scanning for movement. I ate quickly and sat with my back to a tree, knife in hand, staring at the fire until my eyes burned. That night was worse. I didn't even try to sleep. I just sat in the tent with my flashlight, listening. The steps came again, but this time I knew I wasn't imagining it. They were slow, careful, moving just outside the circle of firelight. Sometimes they stopped completely, leaving me straining to hear, my heart hammering. Once I thought I saw the faint outline of a figure standing between the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. I wanted to shout, to tell whoever it was to leave, but the thought of making noise terrified me. If they knew I was awake, what would they do? Hours passed like that in a state of frozen panic. When dawn finally came, I stumbled out exhausted. The woods were calm, bright, as if nothing had happened. But the ground near my camp told a different story. I saw clear footprints in the dirt circling the clearing, some leading closer to my tent, then back into the trees. They weren't boot prints like mine. They looked like old sneakers worn flat at the heel. I knew I should leave, but for some reason I didn't. Maybe pride kept me there. Maybe I told myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting. I decided I'd stay one more night. I spent the day on edge, jumping at every sound, checking over my shoulder constantly. When I returned to camp, I gathered more firewood than before and built the fire high, hoping the light would keep whoever it was away. As darkness fell, the forest grew colder. I sat with my knife on my lap, staring into the trees. The hours crawled by. Then sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps closer than ever, just beyond the firelight. My chest tightened as I saw movement. This time I didn't imagine it. A figure stood there, barely visible, watching me. I gripped the knife tighter, my hand slick with sweat. The figure didn't move for a long time, just stood there. Then slowly, it backed away into the darkness, vanishing without a sound. I didn't sleep at all. At dawn, I packed everything as fast as I could. I wanted out. The hike back felt endless, every crunch of leaves making me flinch. When I finally reached the parking lot, my relief died instantly. My car door was open. I ran up and saw the inside torn apart, glove box emptied, stuff thrown across the seats. Nothing was stolen, at least nothing valuable, but it was clear. Someone had been inside. Someone had followed me all the way back. The drive out was the longest of my life. My hands shook on the steering wheel the entire time, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror again and again, half expecting to see someone following. When I finally made it home, I locked the doors and sat in silence for hours. The woods no longer felt like a place to escape to. They felt like something alive, something that had watched me, tested me, and let me leave only because it wanted to. I never went camping alone again. I didn't plan for things to go wrong when I went camping that weekend. I just wanted to be alone. Away from noise, away from people, away from the constant pull of screens and routines. I picked a spot far out. Not a regular campground, but a patch of forest I found while tracing satellite maps online. It looked like no one went there much. A stream cut through the trees, and there were open patches where I thought I could set up camp. I packed everything I needed. A tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, food sealed in bags, a flashlight, extra batteries, a knife, and a change of clothes. The drive out was long and quiet, the kind where the roads get smaller and smaller until they're more like paths than roads. I parked my car off a dirt stretch where branches brushed the sides, leaving faint scratches on the paint. When I killed the engine, the silence fell heavy. It was the kind of silence you don't hear in town, thick and total, broken only by the buzz of insects and the occasional call of a bird somewhere deep inside the trees. I loaded my backpack, heavier than it should have been, and started walking. The ground was uneven, with roots curling up like ropes and patches of soft dirt where my boots sank slightly. The air was damp, carrying the smell of wet leaves and moss. I followed a faint deer trail, almost hidden, and after maybe an hour I reached the spot I had marked on the map. The trees opened just enough to let in a slice of light. The stream was close, its trickling sound constant, steady, almost calming. I set up my tent facing the water. The fabric snapped in the breeze as I pulled the poles through. The ground was soft, easy to stake down. I laid my sleeping bag inside, lined my gear along the edges, and stepped back to look at it. The tent stood small, almost fragile against the endless trees. For a while I just stood there, listening. Every so often I thought I heard something deeper in the woods, a branch snapping, faint rustling. But I told myself it was only animals, deer maybe, or raccoons. By evening I cooked a small meal on the stove, the hiss of the flame loud in the quiet. The food didn't taste like much, but I was hungry enough not to care. The sky shifted colors, blue to gray to the deep shades of night. When darkness settled, it was heavier than I expected. In the city, even far suburbs, there's always some glow. Streetlights, windows, the orange haze in the clouds. Here there was nothing. When I turned off my flashlight, the dark swallowed me whole. I lay in my tent, the nylon fabric thin as paper between me and the forest. The stream kept its steady sound, but under it I started picking out other noises. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. At first it blended into the normal sounds of a forest at night, but then I noticed how irregular it was. It wasn't like the wind pushing through branches. It was sharper, more deliberate, like steps. I told myself it had to be deer, or maybe a raccoon nosing around. I turned onto my side, tried to ignore it, pulled the sleeping bag up tighter. But the sound kept coming, not steady, but in bursts. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther. I stayed awake longer than I thought I would, my ears tuned to every shift of sound. At some point exhaustion won and I slipped into uneasy sleep. When I woke, gray light seeped through the tent walls. Morning mist hung low, curling between the trees. I stepped out, stretching stiff limbs, and walked to the stream to wash my face. The water was ice cold, shocking, but it felt good. As I stood up, something caught my eye. The ground near my tent had marks. At first I thought they were just deer tracks, but when I crouched down I saw they weren't the neat cloven prints I expected. They looked more like boot prints, faint but there. Not mine, I could see mine clearly, heavier and deeper from carrying the pack. These were lighter, smaller, pressed into the dirt at odd angles, circling halfway around my tent. I stayed crouched for a while, staring. My skin prickled cold even though the air wasn't that chilly. I told myself someone might have been hiking, maybe a hunter passing by, but it made no sense. I hadn't seen a single person the whole way in, and this wasn't a marked trail. The prints weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. The edges were still sharp, not blurred by rain or time. I spent the day trying to shake it off. I walked up along the stream, followed it into thicker woods just to see more of the land. The forest stretched endlessly, pine and oak tangled together, their trunks straight and tall. I collected dry wood and stacked it by camp. By late afternoon I was more tired than I expected, my shoulders aching, my feet sore from uneven ground. When night fell again, the unease returned. I built a small fire, the flames snapping and spitting. I sat close, the heat warming my face, the smoke stinging my eyes. The forest seemed alive around me, filled with movements I couldn't quite see. I heard an owl call once, long and low, then the silence pressed back in. Later, when the fire burned down, I crawled into my tent. The night air had dropped colder, enough that I pulled the bag up to my chin. My flashlight sat by my side, switched off. I tried to breathe slow, steady, willing myself to sleep. But again, the noises came. This time they were clearer. Footsteps. Not heavy, but slow, deliberate, like someone trying not to make noise. The hairs on my arms stood straight. I lay still, my ears straining. The steps circled, soft crunches of leaves, pauses in between. I held my breath, counting the seconds, every muscle tense. At one point, the sound stopped right outside the tent. The nylon wall between me and it felt too thin, like I could almost feel the weight of something on the other side. I didn't move. My heartbeat was so loud I was sure it could be heard outside. Minutes stretched like hours. Then the sound shifted, moving away, fading into the distance. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke with the sun high. My throat was dry, my stomach tight with hunger, but all I could think about were the prints. I stepped outside and scanned the ground. There were more now, clearer. A trail of them pressed in a half circle around the tent, overlapping mine in places. They weren't mine. The size, the depth, it was like someone had been pacing, watching. My chest felt hollow as I stared at them. I thought about packing up right then, but I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe the prints were old and I just hadn't seen them before. I told myself I could handle one more night. The day passed slow. I walked farther, tried to fish in the stream but caught nothing, my line only snagging on rocks. I ate a stale energy bar and sat on a log, staring at the trees as if they might move. I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. That night I didn't build a fire. I thought maybe the light had drawn someone. Instead, I sat in the dark, wrapped in my jacket, listening. My nerves were frayed, every sound sharp. When I finally lay in the tent, I kept the knife in my hand under the bag. The noises came again, but this time closer, more certain. Leaves shifted, sticks cracked. Not rushed, not clumsy, but patient. I gripped the knife so hard my hand ached. The steps circled again, slow and steady. At one point I swore I heard breathing outside, faint but real. Then a sound that froze me. A zipper. The faintest touch at mine. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would tear out of my chest. The tent wall quivered slightly as if brushed. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The sound stopped. After what felt like hours, the noises drifted away again. When dawn came, I didn't hesitate. I shoved everything into my pack, barely folding, barely caring. I wanted out. The forest felt different now, heavy and suffocating. I followed my tracks back, but something felt off. The trail I had taken seemed changed, like the forest had shifted in the night. I pressed on, my nerves raw, my head snapping at every sound. Halfway back, I saw something that made my stomach turn. On a tree, carved deep into the bark, were marks. Not random scratches, but lines, straight and deliberate. Fresh. Too fresh. And on the dirt at the base, another print. A boot print, clear, facing the direction of my camp. I walked faster, almost running, my breath sharp. I kept checking behind me. Sure, I'd see someone, but the woods stayed empty. My car came into view like a lifeline. I unlocked it with shaking hands, threw my gear inside, and slammed the doors. The silence pressed around me as I sat gripping the wheel, breathing hard. Before I started the engine, I looked at the edge of the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a shadow slipping between trunks, too far to make out. Then it was gone. I drove until the forest was a blur in the rearview mirror, until roads widened, until I saw signs of life again. My hands didn't stop shaking until I was miles away. I don't know who was out there. Maybe just some person wandering. Maybe something worse. All I know is someone had been watching me, circling me, standing just beyond the thin wall of my tent. And if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have left. I remember the exact moment I stepped out of my truck and breathed in the air of the woods that evening. It was thick with the smell of pine, damp earth, and the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. The gravel crunched under my boots, and for a brief second the world felt quiet and simple. I had chosen this spot at random on a map, thinking it would be a good place to clear my head for a few days. I wasn't looking for adventure, just silence, a stretch of time without my phone, without work, without people. The trailhead had been empty when I pulled up. That should have comforted me, but instead it unsettled me in a way I didn't recognize at first. I kept telling myself that it was good. No people meant no noise, no interruptions. It was what I wanted. I slung my pack over my shoulders, tightened the straps, and started the hike deeper into the trees. The first few miles weren't difficult. The trail was clear, though narrow, with patches of roots snaking across the dirt like old scars. I could hear the occasional bird overhead, the rush of a distant creek, and the constant buzz of insects. Sweat quickly collected on my back and around my collar, sticking the fabric of my shirt to my skin. The light from the late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy in shifting patches, making it hard to judge how far I'd gone or how much daylight I had left. I stopped once, leaning on my knees and sipping from my water bottle. My ears rang in the silence. I realized how far away the world was already. The trailhead was behind me, the road even farther. There was nothing out here but trees, rocks, dirt, and the weight of the forest pressing in from every direction. That realization brought both comfort and unease. By the time I found a decent clearing, the sun had already begun to sink lower. The sky was shifting from pale blue to a washed-out orange that barely filtered through the branches above. I set down my pack, my shoulders sore, my legs heavy, and began the work of setting up camp. The ground was uneven, littered with pine cones and small stones, but I cleared a space as best I could. My tent was small, barely enough room for me and my gear, but it felt like a barrier, a little bubble of safety against the endless dark that would come soon. Once the tent was up, I gathered a pile of sticks and tried to start a fire. It took longer than it should have. My hands were stiff and the wood was damp from recent rain. Sparks hissed and died until finally one caught and the flame grew. I fed it carefully, crouched low, my face warming from the glow. The fire was small, fragile looking compared to the forest around it, but it was mine. The smell of smoke rose into the air, curling upward until it vanished into the black canopy. I ate a simple meal from my pack. Nothing special, just fuel to fill the empty feeling in my stomach. Afterward, I sat there for a long while staring at the fire, letting my thoughts wander. The quiet pressed in harder now. The birds had gone silent. The insects had changed their rhythm. There was a stillness, a waiting kind of silence, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. When night fully came, it was darker than I expected. My fire cast a small circle of orange light, but beyond that, everything was swallowed in black. The trees became silhouettes, their shapes twisting together into one endless wall. I thought about how far from anything I was, how a simple wrong step in the dark could leave me wandering without direction. That thought tightened my chest. I crawled into the tent, zipped it closed, and lay on my back with my sleeping bag pulled tight around me. The ground was cold and uneven, and every sound outside felt amplified. A branch snapping in the distance made my body tense. Leaves rustling seemed closer than they should have been. I told myself it was animals, the usual kind of movement you'd expect out here: deer, raccoons, maybe a coyote. My mind wanted to believe it, but my body didn't relax. Sometime in the night, I woke up suddenly. My mouth was dry and my heart was racing before I even understood why. I listened. At first, I heard nothing but my own breath, shallow and uneven. Then it came. A sound. Footsteps. Not the quick, erratic movements of an animal, but steady, deliberate crunches of weight pressing into the ground. They were faint, but close enough to make me freeze. I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the fabric of the tent above me. The footsteps stopped, then started again, circling. My skin prickled. I told myself it could be a deer, maybe even a bear, but it didn't feel right. Bears didn't move like that. They didn't stop and start, slow and measured, like someone pacing. Minutes passed. My muscles ached from staying rigid. Eventually, the footsteps drifted away, fading into the distance until I couldn't hear them anymore. I told myself it had been nothing, just the forest playing tricks on me, but I didn't sleep much after that. When dawn came, the light was thin and gray. My fire had gone out, leaving only a pile of cold ashes. I stepped outside, stiff from the night, and scanned the clearing. My eyes caught something in the dirt. Tracks, not animal tracks. Footprints. They weren't mine. They were longer, wider, pressed deep into the soft earth. They circled the tent in a loose pattern, weaving close and then pulling away again. My stomach twisted. Someone had been here. Someone had walked around my camp while I was inside pretending to sleep. I packed my things quickly, barely eating. My hands shook as I stuffed the tent into its bag, my eyes darting toward the trees again and again. Every shadow looked like it was hiding something. Every sound in the distance made me flinch. I thought about leaving, about hiking straight back to my truck, but something stubborn in me said I could stick it out. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stupidity. I told myself it was just some stranger passing through. Maybe another hiker curious about my fire. That had to be it. I decided to move camp anyway. I hiked deeper, putting as much distance as I could between myself and that clearing. The trail grew rougher, the brush thicker. Branches clawed at my arms as I pushed through. My boots slipped on loose rocks more than once, and I nearly twisted my ankle on a hidden root. Still, I kept going until the light began to dim again. This time I set up in a tighter space between trees. The ground was damp and the air was cooler, carrying the sharp bite of water. I realized I was close to the creek I had heard yesterday. The constant rush of it drowned out the smaller sounds of the woods, which gave me a strange sense of comfort. I built another fire, smaller this time, and sat with my back against a tree, watching the flames lick the air. But I couldn't shake the thought of those footprints. The way they circled me, the way they had appeared in the night without a sound, until the person wanted me to hear them. It wasn't an accident. Whoever it was had wanted me to know they were there. That night was worse. I lay in the tent, my body tired but my mind sharp with unease. I listened harder than I ever had before, straining against the sound of the creek, and then sometime after midnight I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, steady, closer than before. This time I didn't just hear them. I saw a shadow pass over the thin wall of my tent. My throat tightened. The fire outside had burned low, but it was enough to cast shapes. A figure moved, tall and deliberate, circling once again. I held my breath. My chest ached with the effort. The figure paused inches from where my head rested. I could see the outline of legs, the faint curve of a shoulder. My skin crawled, every nerve screaming to move, to run, to do anything but lie there. But I stayed still. Eventually the shadow drifted away. The footsteps faded. I lay there until the sky lightened again, every second dragging out like an hour. In the morning I didn't hesitate. I packed faster than I thought possible, shoving gear into my pack with no care for order. My chest felt tight, my thoughts racing. I told myself I'd had enough, that I'd cut my trip short and hike back to the truck. But when I reached for the trail, I froze. The path was different. Branches were broken in ways I didn't remember. Piles of stones had been placed along the edges, small stacks that hadn't been there before. I walked faster, my breath quick and uneven. My eyes kept darting behind me, expecting to see someone there, following just out of sight. The deeper I went, the less familiar it felt. Landmarks I thought I remembered were gone. I tried to stay calm, but the truth settled into me like a weight. I was lost. I wandered for hours, the sun climbing high and then falling again. My water ran low. My legs burned with each step. The forest all looked the same, endless trees, endless shadows, and every so often I'd find signs, footprints in the dirt, a strip of cloth caught on a branch, another pile of stones. Whoever was out here, they weren't just passing by. They were leading me, hurting me. By the second night, I was too tired to build a fire. I just crawled into the tent and curled up, shaking, my stomach empty, my mouth dry. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every noise outside felt sharper, closer. At one point, I swore I heard breathing just outside the tent wall. The third day blurred together. I stumbled through the woods, barely aware of direction anymore. My skin was scratched raw from branches, my lips cracked. I found the creek again and drank until my stomach hurt, but it didn't help the hollow ache inside me. That night, I didn't even bother with the tent. I collapsed against a tree, my pack still on, and tried to stay awake. My head kept dipping though, and I had always thought camping alone would be a good way to clear my head. I had gone with friends before, but this time I wanted to test myself. I wanted silence, no one around me, just the woods, the cold air, and the sound of my own fire crackling. I picked a weekend in late fall, when the nights got cold enough to sting, but not yet freezing. And I drove out far past the last paved road into an area that was all dirt tracks, fallen leaves, and tall, thin trees that looked the same no matter which direction I turned. The trail I followed wasn't marked. It was just one of those rugged tracks hunters and loggers sometimes used, rutted deep from trucks and softened by rain. My old backpack weighed heavy on my shoulders, and each step felt harder than it should have been, because of how uneven the ground was. I had my tent rolled up, a sleeping bag, some food I had packed in sealed bags, a small hatchet, and a knife I had sharpened the night before. I wasn't thinking about safety in terms of other people. I was more worried about animals, and even then I wasn't that worried. I thought the woods would be quiet and empty. I hiked until the path thinned into nothing but damp earth under my boots. I picked a spot near a small clearing. The trees opened up just enough for me to see the sky, a dull gray that promised a longer night than day. I dropped my pack, stretched out my sore shoulders, and started setting up camp. The tent went up slowly because the ground was filled with roots. I had to move it twice just to get the floor somewhat flat. After that, I collected wood, snapping branches that were dry enough to burn and stacked them into a small pile. By the time I got a fire going, the air had cooled enough that my breath came out in thin white clouds. I sat on a log I had dragged over and watched the flames chew at the wood. The woods felt so still it was almost unnatural. I didn't hear birds, not even the flutter of wings, and there were no crickets or frogs. Just the fire and the creaking of trees when the wind shifted through them. I told myself it was peaceful. That was why I came out here. But every time I looked into the woods, the shadows between the trunks seemed darker than they should have been. I ate a small meal of jerky and a granola bar, washed it down with water from my canteen, and stoked the fire higher. The light stretched farther into the clearing, but it didn't make me feel better. It just gave me a wider circle where I could see nothing happening. I stayed up late, not because I wanted to, but because my body refused to relax. My ears kept picking up faint sounds, branches snapping, a soft crunch of leaves, the distant thud of something heavier than a rabbit moving. Each time I froze, staring into the dark, but nothing ever came into view. When I finally crawled into the tent, I zipped it up tight and curled into my sleeping bag. The nylon walls of the tent were thin, and the fire outside burned low, its glow fading. I listened to the woods again. I heard something walking slow, one step, then silence, then another. The weight in the steps was wrong for a deer, heavier. I held my breath, heart hammering against my ribs, and waited. The steps stopped close to the tent. I could hear breathing. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a bear. I gripped the knife I kept beside me and lay stiff as stone. Minutes passed and the breathing faded. I don't know how long I stayed awake after that, but eventually exhaustion pulled me under. When I opened my eyes, the sky outside was pale with morning. The fire was nothing but ash. I pushed out of the tent, stretching, trying to shake the tight knot of unease in my chest. That was when I noticed it. Footprints in the soft dirt just beyond the tent. Not paw prints, not hooves, boots. Someone had walked right up to where I had been sleeping. The prints circled the tent once, then disappeared back into the woods. The air felt colder than it had any right to be. My mouth was dry. I scanned the trees, but everything looked the same. Empty. Too empty. I packed my bag tighter, double-checked my knife, and debated leaving. But part of me told myself I was overreacting. Maybe they were old prints, even though I knew deep down they weren't. The ground was still damp and the edges of the tracks were sharp. Someone had been there while I slept. I tried to brush it off by focusing on small tasks. I boiled some water over the rekindled fire, sipped it to warm myself, and went for a short walk to collect more wood. The forest floor was thick with dead leaves, and every step felt loud. I kept looking over my shoulder, sure I'd see someone standing there watching. But there was nothing. By afternoon, the sky darkened again, clouds piling heavy and low. The light drained out fast, and I felt the weight of being alone settle harder on me. I decided to make the fire twice as big. I sat closer to it, staring into the flames, trying to ignore the way the wood seemed to press tighter in the dark. The silence wasn't normal. Even animals should have made noise. When the sound came, it was sharper than before. A clean snap of a stick, like someone stepping wrong. Then another, closer. My throat tightened. I gripped the hatchet this time, holding it in my lap, and kept my eyes locked on the tree line. The fire cracked and popped, but behind it something moved. A flicker of shadow, a glimpse of pale fabric between the trees. I didn't move. My whole body froze, my breath caught. Whoever it was didn't step into the clearing. They stayed just far enough back that I couldn't see them clearly. Minutes dragged, and then the sound faded again. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the fire, feeding it constantly, watching the dark. My nerves were stretched so thin, every small noise made me jolt. At one point I thought I heard whispering, low and muffled, but when I strained to listen, the woods went silent again. When daylight finally came, it felt weak. I was exhausted, my eyes burning, my body aching from sitting upright all night. I checked the perimeter of the clearing. More footprints, fresh. They had come closer this time, circling wider, then stopping just short of where the light from the fire would have reached. I knew I had to leave. I stuffed everything into my pack haphazardly, kicked dirt over the fire, and slung the bag onto my back. The woods looked different now, harder to read. I couldn't tell which way the trail was. I picked what I thought was the direction I came from and started walking fast, almost jogging. The forest closed in around me, tall trunks crowding tighter. Every few minutes I heard something behind me. Leaves shifting, a faint crunch. When I stopped, it stopped. When I moved, it started again. The sound wasn't an animal. It matched me, step for step. Hours passed like that. My water was running low, my legs heavy, but I couldn't stop. I turned suddenly at one point, hoping to catch whoever was behind me. But there was nothing. Just endless trees, shadows, and silence. My skin prickled with the certainty that eyes were on me. By late afternoon, I realized I was lost. The trail was gone if I had even been on it. Panic clawed at my chest, but I forced myself to keep moving. I stumbled into a small dip in the land, a hollow filled with rotting logs. That's when I saw it. A piece of blue fabric caught on a branch, faded, torn. I stepped closer. Beneath the log, half buried in leaves, was an old boot. My stomach twisted. It was too small to be fresh. It looked like it had been there for years, weather-worn. But the sight of it sent ice through me. Someone else had been lost out here, and they hadn't made it out. As the sun sank, the woods grew darker and colder. I had no choice but to set up camp again. I found a spot against a boulder and lit the last of my dry wood. The fire barely lasted an hour. I sat in the dark after it went out, knife in my hand, every nerve screaming. The footsteps came again, closer. This time I didn't just hear them, I saw movement. A figure, tall and thin, standing between two trees. Not moving, just watching. My chest seized. I wanted to shout, but my throat locked. I blinked and the figure was gone. I didn't sleep. I sat up all night, shivering, eyes wide, ears straining. At some point I must have blacked out from exhaustion, because when I opened my eyes, daylight was bleeding into the trees. My head throbbed, my lips cracked from thirst. I forced myself up and walked, moving without direction, just desperate to get out. The woods stretched on and on. My legs felt like lead, my vision blurred. I thought I heard someone behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing but empty trees. My heart felt like it was tearing itself apart. Then through the trees I saw something, a flash of gravel, a road. My knees almost buckled with relief. I stumbled toward it, branches clawing at me, lungs burning. When I burst out onto the narrow dirt road, I dropped to my knees, gasping. The woods behind me were still. Too still. I didn't look back. I staggered along the road until I heard the distant hum of an engine. A truck came into view and I waved weakly. The driver slowed, staring at me with wide eyes. I must have looked half dead, filthy and shaking. I climbed into the truck without a word. As we drove away, I kept my eyes locked forward. I didn't dare glance back into the trees because I knew, deep in my bones, that if I did, I'd see someone standing there at the edge, watching me leave, and I knew they'd still be there, waiting for whoever was foolish enough to camp alone again. I had planned the camping trip weeks before. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city and breathe air that did not carry the smell of cars and smoke. I picked a spot far enough into the woods that I wouldn't run into families with coolers and radios. I wanted to be alone. I drove out early that morning. My car loaded with supplies I had carefully packed: a tent, sleeping bag, small stove, water containers, a folding chair, and enough food for 4 days. I had checked and rechecked everything the night before, making sure I wasn't forgetting even the smallest tool, because I knew how quickly comfort could turn into misery when something as simple as a knife or lighter was missing. The trail that led to the place I had marked on my map was narrow, more like a deer path than something made for people. I parked where the dirt road ended and carried everything on my back. The load was heavy but manageable. The air was cool, the sun was out, and the only sound came from the crunch of dry leaves under my boots and the occasional call of a bird. It took me 2 hours to reach the clearing I had chosen. It was a flat patch of ground near a stream, surrounded by tall pines and oaks. The stream wasn't wide, but it was enough for fresh water and a soft background sound. I set the tent up carefully, making sure the stakes were firm. I laid my sleeping bag inside, placed the stove and food in a neat pile, and organized everything the way I liked. I always felt calmer once camp was in order. The first day went as planned. I gathered some wood, built a small fire, and sat in my chair as the sun dropped lower. I cooked a simple meal, ate slowly, and listened to the forest as it changed with the fading light. It felt good to be away from everything. I told myself I would hike further the next morning, maybe follow the stream until I reached higher ground. That night I crawled into my tent, zipped it closed, and let the steady hum of crickets carry me into sleep. The sound woke me sometime deep in the night. It was faint at first, just enough to tug me out of sleep, but then it came again, clearer. It was the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. My heart immediately started to beat harder. I stayed still, trying to listen past the fabric of the tent. The sound came again, slow, deliberate steps, not the quick scurry of an animal. I held my breath and waited. After a minute, the steps stopped. The forest went quiet again, unnaturally quiet, as though everything had frozen. I told myself it could have been a deer. It could have been anything. But the thought of a person out there unsettled me more than anything else. I was miles from the road. Nobody should have been walking around at that hour. I stayed awake for a long time, staring at the thin nylon walls of the tent until exhaustion forced me back into sleep. In the morning, I tried to brush it off. I made coffee, ate some oatmeal, and forced myself to act normal. Still, I checked the ground around my camp. The leaves and dirt showed no clear signs, but I thought I saw a faint depression near the edge of the clearing, as though someone had stood there watching. I didn't dwell on it. I decided to go ahead with my hike. I followed the stream for hours, climbing over rocks and weaving through thick brush. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. At one point, I realized I hadn't heard a bird in over an hour. The silence pressed in on me. By the time I made it back to camp in the afternoon, my legs ached and my throat was dry. The second night was worse. I had just drifted into sleep when I heard the sound again. Footsteps. This time they circled. I could hear them moving slowly around the clearing, crunching leaves, pausing, then moving again. I froze inside the tent, gripping the knife I kept near my sleeping bag. The steps moved closer, stopped near the tent, then faded away. I didn't sleep after that. At the first light of dawn, I crawled out of the tent and scanned the area. My fire pit had been disturbed. The stones I had placed neatly were shifted, and one of the logs had been dragged out. My backpack, which I had left leaning against a tree, was lying on its side. Nothing was missing, but the sight made my stomach tighten. Someone had been there. I debated leaving. Part of me wanted to pack everything and head back to the car, but another part of me resisted. I had come all this way. Maybe it was just some wanderer passing through. Maybe I was letting my imagination get the better of me. In the end, I stayed, though I kept my knife close the entire day. The third night was the worst. I had built the fire larger, hoping the light would keep anything away. The flames crackled and threw shadows against the trees. I sat with my back to the tent, staring into the dark woods. Hours passed. Then just past midnight, I saw movement between the trees. A figure. It stood still, half hidden behind a trunk, just far enough that I couldn't make out details. My chest tightened. I stayed frozen in my chair, not daring to move. After what felt like minutes, the figure shifted, stepped back, and vanished into the dark. I listened for the sound of steps but heard nothing. I didn't go into the tent that night. I stayed by the fire, feeding it wood until dawn. My eyes burned from smoke and lack of sleep, but I didn't dare close them. When daylight came, I finally decided to leave. I packed fast, shoving everything into my backpack without the usual care. The thought of staying another night was unbearable. I doused the fire, hoisted the pack, and started down the trail. My nerves were stretched tight, every sound making me turn my head. Half an hour into the hike, I realized I wasn't alone. The sound of steps echoed mine, just far enough back that I couldn't see. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they moved. My skin crawled. I didn't call out, didn't look back. I just kept walking, faster and faster, until my legs screamed. At one bend in the trail, I risked a glance over my shoulder. A man stood there. He was thin, wearing dark clothes, his face hidden in shadow. He didn't move, just stood watching me. My blood went cold. I turned back and forced myself forward, heart pounding so hard I thought I would faint. The trail twisted, climbed, and dipped, but every so often I heard him behind me, steady, patient, never rushing. By the time I reached the spot where my car was parked, sweat was pouring down my back. My hands shook so badly I fumbled with the keys. I yanked the door open, threw my pack inside, and climbed in. As I started the engine, I looked back one last time. He was standing at the edge of the trees, still and silent, watching me. I drove without stopping, my eyes flicking constantly to the mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind me, but the road stayed empty. When I finally reached home, I locked every door and window. For days I barely slept, expecting to see that figure outside my house. He never came, but the memory of him standing in the woods has stayed with me. I never went camping alone again. I had always enjoyed being outdoors, and camping was something that gave me peace. I didn't need fancy gear or a big group to have fun. Most times I preferred going alone. It gave me a break from people, noise, and the constant rush of everything. I could just carry my pack, walk into the woods, set up a tent, and let the world disappear for a while. That year I had been working non-stop, and I wanted a few days away from everything. I picked a random spot on the map, a stretch of forest far enough from the city where I wouldn't run into many people, but not so far that it would be impossible to reach on foot. I loaded up my pack with the usual things: tent, sleeping bag, small stove, enough food for a few days, a knife, flashlight, and a first aid kit. My phone had a decent battery, but I wasn't counting on service in the woods, so I carried a paper map and compass. It was late summer, hot during the day and cooler at night. I thought it would be perfect. The trail I chose wasn't well known. It didn't have signs, just a small dirt path cutting into the trees. At first it felt peaceful. Birds, the sound of wind moving through leaves, the crunch of dirt under my boots. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. I noticed how the air felt heavier, how even the insects didn't buzz as much once I was a few miles in. It wasn't unusual for forests to be quiet, but this quiet felt different, heavier, almost like the woods didn't want me there. By the time the sun started to drop, I found a small clearing to set up camp. It was surrounded by tall trees with thick trunks, and the ground was soft with pine needles. I pitched my tent, gathered some dry wood, and started a small fire. Dinner was just a packet of rice and jerky, simple but enough. After eating, I sat by the fire until it burned low, then crawled into my tent. The first night was calm. I heard the usual sounds: branches snapping in the distance, the occasional rustle of small animals moving through brush. It was normal. I slept without much trouble, only waking up once to adjust my sleeping bag. The second day, I decided to explore deeper. I left most of my things in the tent and carried just water, snacks, and a small knife. I followed faint paths, walked along a shallow stream, and cut through dense thickets. I saw deer tracks, and once I thought I saw movement far away, maybe a large animal, but it vanished quickly into the trees. After hours of walking, I noticed something strange. There were signs of people, but not recent ones. I found a torn blue tarp half buried under leaves, a rusted can, and what looked like the frame of an old camp chair. All of it looked abandoned long ago, weathered and forgotten. It made me uneasy, but not enough to turn back. When I returned to my camp that evening, something felt off. My tent was still standing, but the fire pit I had made had been disturbed. The rocks were shifted and ashes scattered like something had pawed at it. At first I thought it was just an animal, maybe raccoons, but the way the rocks were moved looked intentional, almost careful. I told myself I was overthinking and tried to ignore it. I cooked a meal, ate quickly, and went to bed. That night I woke up to a sound outside the tent. At first I thought it was just the forest again, maybe branches creaking or something falling, but then I heard steady steps. They were slow, deliberate, crushing pine needles underfoot. I held my breath, listening. The steps circled the tent, stopping once or twice, then continued. I waited, heart pounding, until the sound faded away. I didn't sleep much after that. When daylight came, I unzipped the tent carefully and stepped out. The ground outside had faint impressions, shoe prints, not animal tracks. The size was hard to tell, but they weren't mine. They came from the trees, circled the tent, and went back the way they came. I stood there staring for a long time, feeling the quiet of the woods pressing in. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but part of me didn't want to admit I was scared. I told myself it could have been another camper passing by, maybe curious. Still, the trail I had taken wasn't common and I hadn't seen anyone for miles. I spent the third day staying close to camp. I gathered more wood, boiled water, and tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked into the trees, I thought I saw something shift, a shape that disappeared when I focused. That night, I made sure the fire was strong before I got into the tent. I laid in my sleeping bag with the knife close by. Hours passed in silence. Then faintly I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps. This time they didn't circle. They stopped right outside. I could hear breathing, slow and steady. My throat was dry and every muscle in me tensed. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like forever. Then slowly they moved away. I didn't sleep at all. When morning came, I stepped outside and checked the ground again. The prints were clearer this time, definitely human, definitely fresh. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed up quickly, stuffing everything into my bag. I followed the trail back, moving faster than usual. But after a while, I realized something that made my stomach turn. The path looked different. Landmarks I remembered weren't there. The stream I had crossed seemed to be in the wrong place. It was as if I had taken the wrong way, but I had been careful. I pulled out the map and compass, but nothing matched. Panic set in as I walked faster, trying to find anything familiar. Hours passed and the sun started dropping again. I couldn't find my way back to the main trail. My legs ached and my water was running low. I had no choice but to set up camp again in a different clearing. That night was worse than the others. I didn't light a fire, afraid it would draw attention. I just sat in the dark, clutching the knife. Every sound made me flinch. At one point, I heard branches snap close by. Then the sound of something being dragged slowly across the ground. I stayed still, heart racing so hard I thought it would give me away. In the morning, I found marks in the dirt, long drag lines like something heavy had been pulled through. They led off into the trees and disappeared. The next 2 days blurred together. I wandered aimlessly, trying to find my way out, eating less and drinking sparingly. I felt weaker, my body sore from lack of rest. I thought about how random this trip had been, how careless I had been to just pick a spot without telling anyone exactly where I was going. On the 5th night, I couldn't hold out anymore. Exhaustion forced me to close my eyes in the tent. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of the zipper slowly being pulled. My blood froze. I reached for the knife, gripping it tight. The zipper stopped halfway, then stayed still. I didn't move, didn't breathe. After what felt like hours, it closed again. At dawn, I packed up with trembling hands. I didn't care about direction anymore. I just pushed forward, determined to get out or collapse trying. My body felt like it was running on nothing, but adrenaline kept me moving. I stumbled through brush, tore my clothes on branches, scratched my arms and legs. Finally, sometime late in the afternoon, I heard a distant sound. Traffic. Faint at first, then clearer. I followed it desperately until I came out to a narrow road. I nearly collapsed when I saw it. I dropped my pack, staggered onto the asphalt, and sat there until a passing truck slowed down. When I finally made it home, I couldn't stop thinking about the woods. About the prints, the steps, the breathing outside my tent. Someone had been out there with me, watching, waiting, following. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew I had been lucky to walk out alive. I haven't gone camping alone since. The forest doesn't feel like peace anymore. It feels like eyes in the dark, footsteps in the dirt, and the sound of a zipper slowly moving in the night. I thought camping alone would clear my head. I had been working too much, sleeping too little, and I felt like I was stuck in a loop of screens, noise, and crowded places. I wanted quiet. I wanted to hear nothing but the wind moving through the trees, to feel the dirt under my boots, to sit by a fire that I built with my own hands. I didn't plan it for weeks or anything like that. It was random. I just grabbed my gear on a Friday afternoon and drove north toward the woods, not really caring which spot I ended up in. I just wanted to disappear for a while. The air got colder as I drove deeper into the forest roads. The paved highway turned into gravel. Then the gravel narrowed into dirt. I watched the cell signal bars disappear from my phone screen. and I felt that strange mixture of comfort and unease that comes when you know you're cut off. I told myself it was good, that it was the point of the trip, but there was still that little knot in my stomach as the car bounced over ruts in the road and branches scraped against the paint. When I finally stopped, it wasn't at any official campsite. I passed a few of those, but they had families, groups of fishermen, kids riding bikes. I wanted none of that. I kept going until I saw a faint pull-off that looked like maybe hunters or hikers used it sometimes. The ground there was flat enough for the car and a small tent, and through the trees I could see a little creek shining in the last light of the sun. I cut the engine and the silence came down like a blanket. I got out, stretched, and listened. There was no traffic, no voices, no airplanes overhead, just the hum of insects and the faint trickle of water. I carried my backpack and tent down to a clearing about 30 yards from the car. The ground was covered in pine needles and dry leaves. I set up the tent slowly, enjoying the simple routine of sliding poles through sleeves, pulling fabric tight, driving stakes into the ground. When the tent was up, I walked down to the creek. The water was shallow, no more than ankle deep, but it ran clear over smooth stones. I crouched down and touched it. It was cold enough to sting. I followed it with my eyes as it wound between the trees and disappeared. There were animal tracks in the mud on both banks. Deer, raccoon, maybe even coyote. That gave me a little thrill. This was real wilderness, or close enough to it. By the time I gathered wood for a fire, the light was draining fast from the sky. The forest shifted from warm gold to a colder bluish gray. The air cooled too, enough that I could see my breath when I exhaled. I built a small fire, fed it until it was steady, then sat on a fallen log and just stared into it. I wasn't hungry. I wasn't tired. I just wanted to sit there and let my mind empty out. For a while it worked. The flames cracked, the smoke rose straight up, and the night sounds grew around me. An owl somewhere in the distance, crickets, the occasional splash from the creek. But the longer I sat, the more I noticed other sounds, sharper, closer. A snap of a twig behind me, a rustle in the brush just beyond the glow of the fire. I turned my head, but the firelight only reached so far. Beyond that, the woods were black. I told myself it was nothing. Animals moving through the undergrowth. Squirrels, maybe a raccoon sniffing for food. Still, I felt my body tighten. I realized then how much darker the forest felt than I expected. At home, even at night, there was always some glow. The street lamps, distant houses, passing cars. Here there was nothing. Just the narrow circle of firelight, and beyond it a wall of black that felt heavy, almost alive. I forced myself to lie down in the tent after putting the fire out, but sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing small noises like steps. Sometimes it was the crunch of dry leaves. Sometimes the swish of something brushing against the tall grass. I lay there with my eyes open, staring at the nylon ceiling of the tent, trying to breathe slow. At one point I thought I heard something closer right outside. I held my breath, listening, waiting for the zipper to move, even though I knew that was a stupid thought. After a long time it faded, or maybe I drifted off without realizing. I woke at first light, stiff and groggy, but relieved to see daylight again. Everything looked harmless in the morning sun. Birds were busy in the trees. The creek sparkled. My car sat just where I left it. I almost laughed at myself for being so wound up the night before. I ate a quick breakfast of granola bars and cold water, then packed a day bag and decided to hike along the creek. I figured if I followed it long enough, I'd get a better sense of the area. Maybe even find where it met a bigger river. The air was cool, but the sun had warmth in it, and hiking felt good. My boots crunched on the gravel of the creek bed, and I felt that calm I had been hoping for when I left home. After maybe an hour, I noticed boot prints in the mud near the water. At first I thought they were mine, but these were fresher, the edges sharp, not yet softened by the sun. They weren't going the same way I was either. They were coming from the opposite direction. I crouched and studied them. The size was close to mine, maybe a little bigger. Definitely not animal. Someone had been walking the creek recently. I stood there for a while, looking downstream, then upstream. I didn't see anyone. The woods were still, except for the sound of water and birds. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe hunters, maybe another camper passing through. But I felt that same little knot form in my stomach again. The rest of the hike I couldn't relax. Every time I saw movement in the trees or heard a branch snap, I thought of those boot prints. By the time I made it back to camp, my shirt was damp with sweat, even though it wasn't hot. That night, the unease grew worse. I built another fire and sat close to it, watching the tree line. I tried to tell myself I was being foolish, that whoever left those prints was long gone. But the noises came again after dark. Not just one or two. It felt like movement circling the camp. Slow, careful steps that stopped when I strained to listen. I gripped my flashlight so hard my hand ached. At one point I thought I saw something between the trees. A darker shape against the black. Human height. Not moving. Just standing. My heart thudded, and I swung the light toward it, but by the time the beam reached, there was nothing there. Just branches and shadows. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in the tent with my knife beside me, every nerve tight. I kept thinking of those tracks. Someone was out here. Someone who wasn't making themselves known. In the morning, I found something that made my chest tighten. Near the creek where the mud was soft, there were more boot prints. New ones fresh, they hadn't been there the day before. They led closer to my camp, then back out again. Someone had come near while I was sleeping. My first thought was to pack up and leave right then, but a stubborn part of me resisted. I had come out here for peace. I didn't want to run just because I was spooked. Maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe someone had walked past, nothing more. But the third night broke that stubbornness. The noises didn't just circle. They came closer. I heard deliberate steps in the dry leaves, slow and heavy. I sat up in the tent, clutching the knife, listening. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would shake the fabric. The steps stopped right outside the tent wall. I could hear breathing, not animal huffing. Human breathing, steady and slow. I froze, afraid to move, afraid even to breathe. Minutes passed. The breathing stayed. Then softly, the sound of fingers dragging across the nylon wall of the tent. Just a slow scrape from one side to the other. I almost bolted out, but I forced myself to stay still. Finally, after what felt like forever, the sound faded. The steps moved away. I didn't sleep a second after that. When dawn came, I packed everything in frantic movements. I didn't eat. I didn't even bother folding the tent right. I shoved it into the car and started the engine. My hands shook on the wheel as I drove out, tires skidding on dirt. The whole way back, I kept checking the mirror. The road was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was just out of sight, watching. When I finally reached pavement, I didn't stop. I drove until I hit a gas station miles away. Only then did I step out, stretch my legs, and breathe like I hadn't in days. I never went back to that spot. I never camped alone again. To this day, when I think about it, what chills me isn't what I saw, because I never really saw anyone. What chills me is what I heard. The breathing outside the tent. The scrape of fingers on the fabric. Someone was out there with me in those woods. Someone who wanted me to know, but not enough to show themselves. And I left before I found out what they really wanted. I had been planning the trip for weeks. The weather was cooling down and the nights were stretching longer, and I thought it was the perfect time to disappear into the woods for a while. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a quiet trip to clear my head, set up camp, cook over a fire, and maybe hike a few trails during the day. I chose a place that wasn't far from home, but still far enough to make me feel cut off. It was one of those deep forest areas where cell service drops completely, where the silence feels thick, where you can walk for hours and not see another person. That was the kind of trip I wanted. Just me in the woods. I packed carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, ground pad, stove, a small axe, a survival knife, a headlamp, 2 flashlights, a backup power bank, food sealed in plastic containers, water bottles, and a small filter pump in case I needed more. I made sure my backpack was balanced because I would be hiking in from the small dirt road that ended near the tree line. I wanted to be at least a mile away from where people parked to avoid running into day hikers. I arrived mid-morning. The air had that sharp smell of pine and damp earth. The ground was littered with fallen needles, and patches of moss clung to rocks and tree roots. I could hear birds in the distance and the faint trickle of water from somewhere downhill. I hoisted my pack and walked into the woods, following no real trail, just moving in deeper. After about 40 minutes, I found a good clearing. It wasn't too open, but it had enough space for a tent, a fire pit, and room to move around. The trees around me were tall and old, their trunks thick, their branches high. The ground was mostly level with a layer of soft dirt. There were no signs of other people having camped there recently, which was exactly what I wanted. I dropped my pack, stretched, and started setting up camp. I cleared away sticks and rocks from the ground, laid out my tent, and drove the stakes in. I set up my tarp over the tent for extra cover in case of rain. The fire pit took some time. I dug out a shallow circle, lined it with rocks, and stacked a small pile of kindling and wood beside it. By the time I was done, I was sweating but satisfied. I sat down on a fallen log, drank water, and listened. It was so quiet. I could hear the occasional woodpecker somewhere far off, and sometimes the wind stirred the branches. But otherwise, it was still. That was the moment I felt the shift, the realization that I was truly alone. I told myself that was the point, but deep down, I knew it could also be unsettling. The first day was uneventful. I explored the area, found the small stream I had heard earlier, and filled one bottle through my filter pump. I returned before sunset, made a small fire, cooked noodles with some dried meat, and sat close to the warmth as the sky darkened. The night fell heavy as it does in deep woods where the canopy blocks the moonlight. I had my headlamp, but I kept it low, trying not to break the feeling of being immersed in nature. When I finally lay in my tent, zipped up in my bag, I noticed how different the night sounded. There were no cars, no voices, nothing human, only the occasional rustle, maybe a small animal moving through the brush, but mostly silence. It was hard to sleep, not because of noise, but because of the absence of it. I drifted in and out, waking often to adjust, listening, making sure nothing was too close. By morning, I was groggy but safe. The second day, I hiked farther out. I didn't bring everything, just a smaller pack with water, snacks, a knife, and my flashlight. The woods went on in every direction. Some places were so thick with undergrowth that I had to push through with my arms. Other areas opened into quiet glades, the ground soft with moss. At one point, I saw what looked like old, broken fence posts, half buried in the dirt, leaning and rotting. They looked like they had been there for decades, maybe marking land no one cared about anymore. I thought about how many people had walked these woods before me, how many had hunted, camped, maybe even lived off them for a while. It gave me a strange feeling, as though I wasn't the first and certainly not the last, but right then, I was the only one. By late afternoon, I made it back to camp. I set about preparing firewood for the evening. I used my axe to split a few thicker branches I had dragged back, stacking them neatly. I cooked rice and tuna, ate slowly, and sat back against my log watching the fire. The flames snapped and hissed, sending sparks upward. It was as the fire died down that I noticed something, a faint sound. It wasn't the usual rustling of small animals. This was heavier, more deliberate. A shift of weight on soil. At first I told myself it was a deer. But deer usually moved in quick bursts, pausing, then darting. This was slower. Almost careful, I held still. The sound stopped. I turned my headlamp toward the trees, but the beam caught only trunks and branches, nothing moving. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to not let panic set in. After a while, I told myself it was nothing, probably just the woods playing tricks. I put more wood on the fire, trying to shake the unease. But that night in my tent, I couldn't relax. Every sound felt sharper, every shift of fabric in my sleeping bag louder. I thought I heard something brushing past the tent once, soft but distinct. My chest tightened, but I stayed still, gripping my knife inside my bag. Minutes dragged into hours until exhaustion finally pulled me into sleep. Morning came gray and cool. I crawled out, stretching, trying to convince myself it had been nothing. I checked around the tent. The dirt showed marks, but it was hard to tell if they were just from me or something else. Some patches looked disturbed, like leaves brushed aside, but I couldn't be certain. I spent most of that day uneasy. I tried hiking again, but found myself glancing back too often, listening for sounds. The woods didn't feel the same anymore. That strange comfort of solitude had been replaced by the sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. When I returned to camp, I noticed something subtle but undeniable. My backpack, which I had left zipped and leaned against a log, was slightly open. Not wide, not dumped out, but unzipped enough that I knew I hadn't left it that way. My heart thudded. I checked quickly. Nothing seemed missing, but the fact someone had touched it at all was enough. That night I made a larger fire. I thought the light might keep anything away. I sat up later than usual, scanning the woods, the flames flickering shadows across the clearing. At one point I thought I saw something between the trees. Not a shape I could define, but the impression of movement, of someone standing just beyond the firelight. My eyes strained, and for a moment I thought I caught the pale flash of skin. But then it was gone, swallowed by the dark. Sleep was almost impossible. I lay tense, clutching my knife, my ears straining. Hours passed. I thought I heard faint crunches of footsteps circling at a distance, but I couldn't be sure. My stomach twisted with dread. The following morning I made my decision. I would pack up and leave. Whatever was out there, whether animal or person, it wasn't worth staying another night. I began tearing down camp quickly, stuffing things into my pack without the usual care. That's when I noticed the prints. Near the edge of the clearing in soft dirt were footprints. Human footprints, bare feet. The toes and heel were clear. They weren't mine. They circled part of the camp, then disappeared back into the trees. I froze, staring at them. My mouth went dry. Someone had been watching me close, maybe for more than one night. I threw everything together and hoisted my pack, my hands shaking. I started the hike back, moving fast, trying not to look behind me. The woods felt different now, darker, heavier. Every snap of a branch made my pulse jump. About 20 minutes in, I heard it again. Footsteps behind me matching my pace. I stopped. The sound stopped. I went on faster. It came again, faint but steady. Someone was following me, panic set in. I left the direction I came from and cut across, crashing through brush, trying to lose whoever it was. My pack snagged branches, my arms scratched from thorns, but I didn't care. I just needed to put distance between me and them. At some point I realized I was lost. The trees all looked the same. My sense of direction faltered. I turned, trying to reorient, but the silence pressed in again. Then, faintly, from somewhere behind me came the sound of movement. I pushed forward, stumbling, my breath ragged. The light dimmed as the day slipped toward evening. I found myself in a low area, swampy, harder to move quickly. My boots sank into mud. I cursed under my breath, trying to climb back uphill, but I slipped, my pack dragging me down. When I finally reached solid ground, the light was almost gone. I couldn't go farther in the dark. I needed to stop, but stopping meant vulnerability. I found a spot against a thick tree, dropped my pack, and tried to calm myself. I didn't dare make a fire. The glow would be too easy to spot. The night was the worst I had ever lived through. Every few minutes I thought I heard something. Sometimes branches snapping, sometimes what sounded like breath. My flashlight beam shook in my hand as I scanned the trees, but I saw nothing. Hours dragged. At one point I swore I heard slow, deliberate footsteps close enough that I held my breath, afraid even to inhale. I stayed still until my lungs burned, and when I finally let... I wanted to get away for a while, away from the noise of the city and the endless routine that was eating me alive. I told myself a short camping trip would be enough to reset my head. I didn't want crowded campgrounds, no families with kids running around, no groups blasting music by the fire. I wanted silence, real silence, the kind that only settles in the middle of nowhere. So I picked a spot I found on an old map, an isolated patch of forest miles from any official trail. The map showed a river cutting through the trees and a clearing not far from the bank. It looked perfect. I packed light but carefully. A small tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, some food, a flashlight, a knife, and a few other basics. I left early in the morning, parked my car at the far end of a dirt road, and started walking. The path wasn't marked, but I had a compass and a GPS, and I figured if I stuck to the direction of the river, I couldn't go too wrong. The first miles were calm. The forest was quiet, with only the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional bird darting overhead. The deeper I went, the more cut off I felt from the world I knew. There was no cell service, no sound of distant roads, not even the hum of planes, just trees. I walked for hours, sweating through my shirt, and finally I reached the clearing I had seen on the map. It was better than I expected. A flat open space about the size of a small field, ringed with tall pines. The river was close enough that I could hear the slow-moving water, but far enough that I wouldn't wake up to damp air or insects swarming my tent. I set up camp, staked my tent, and built a small fire. For the first time in months, I felt my shoulders loosen. The first day passed easily. I cooked noodles, read a book, and listened to the forest shift as the sun dropped. When darkness fell, it was complete. No lights on the horizon, no glow from distant towns. I lay in my tent, staring at the thin nylon walls, feeling the weight of the silence. It was heavy, but not unpleasant. I drifted off sometime after midnight, the fire outside smoldering to embers. I woke to a noise. It was faint, but sharp enough to cut through my sleep. I held my breath, straining my ears. Something had snapped, like a branch breaking under pressure. My first thought was an animal. A deer maybe, or a raccoon nosing through the forest. I listened longer, but the sound didn't repeat. Slowly I unclenched and forced myself to relax. I told myself it was nothing, rolled over, and eventually slipped back to sleep. The next morning was normal. I made coffee, stretched, and walked down to the river. The water was colder than I expected, and it bit my skin when I washed my face. I noticed prints in the mud by the edge. Not deep, but clear. At first I assumed deer again, but when I looked closer, my stomach tightened. They weren't hoof prints. They looked like boots. Human boots. The mud was soft enough that the tread showed. A rough diamond pattern I didn't recognize. It didn't make sense. I had hiked off trail miles into the woods. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard anyone. Why would someone else be here? I crouched down, touching the edge of one print. It was fresh. Maybe a day old. I tried to brush it off. Maybe a hunter. Maybe someone like me looking for solitude. Still, the thought of someone wandering close to my camp without me noticing stuck with me. When I walked back to the clearing, I scanned the tree line carefully. Nothing moved, no sign of anyone watching. But it left me uneasy. That night I kept the fire bigger. The flames flickered higher, snapping and hissing, throwing long shadows against the trees. I lay in my tent again, staring at the roof, telling myself not to get paranoid. The forest shifted with normal sounds, crickets, an owl, the rustle of leaves. Then sometime deep in the night I heard it again. A snap, closer this time. I froze. My heartbeat jumped into my throat. It wasn't the random fall of a branch. It sounded deliberate, like weight pressing down until the wood gave way. My ears rang with the silence after. Then came another sound, soft, steady. Footsteps. I could hear them circling, slow and careful, just beyond the glow of the dying fire. Leaves crunched faintly, twigs bent. I didn't move. I kept my breathing shallow, straining to pick up every noise. The steps paused. For a long time, there was nothing. My chest ached from holding my breath. When I finally forced myself to peek through the zipper flap, I saw nothing but black trees. The fire had burned down low, and the shadows reached in from all sides. No shapes, no movement, but the hair on my arms stood up stiff. I wasn't alone. Morning felt like a relief. Light pushed the fear back, and I told myself maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe an animal that sounded heavier in the dark. But when I walked the edge of the clearing, I found proof. The ground was disturbed, leaves pushed aside in a wide circle around my camp. Not deer tracks, not random. Someone had walked there slowly all around me, watching. I packed my bag that morning, but I didn't leave. I convinced myself it was stupid to cut the trip short. I had wanted to be alone, and now I was overreacting to signs of another hiker. I tried to enjoy the day. I fished at the river, cooked, and forced myself to relax. But the unease never left. I kept glancing at the trees, expecting to see movement. By the third night, I couldn't shake it anymore. I built another fire, bigger than the last, and sat with my back against my tent, knife in my lap. Hours crawled by. The fire hissed and popped, throwing sparks into the air. I kept waiting, every muscle tight. Then it happened again. A crack, deliberate from the darkness. My chest tightened. The steps came slower this time, like whoever it was knew I was awake. I gripped the knife until my hand ached. The footsteps stopped just out of sight, in the blackness beyond the fire's edge. I thought I saw something move between the trees, but the shadow shifted too much to be sure. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up until dawn, the fire burning low, my eyes dry and heavy. When the light finally spread through the clearing, I searched again. This time I found more than tracks. On the far side of the clearing, pressed into the dirt, was a clear boot print. It was larger than mine. I knew then it wasn't my imagination. Someone was out there watching me. Following me, I decided to leave. I packed fast, shoving gear into my bag, rolling up the tent with shaking hands. I set my compass and started walking hard in the direction of my car. Every snap of a twig behind me sent jolts down my spine. I forced myself not to look back too often, but I could feel it, the sense of being followed. Hours passed. My shoulders screamed under the weight of my pack. My throat dry despite sips from my water bottle. The forest felt endless. The sun shifted and I realized with dread that I wasn't sure if I had veered off course. I checked the compass again, trying to steady my hands, but doubt gnawed at me. Then I saw it. A broken branch bent unnaturally low, pointing into the trees. At first I thought it was coincidence, but then I noticed another. And another. Subtle but deliberate, like markers. My stomach turned cold. Someone had left signs, guiding or warning, I couldn't tell which. The worst part was when I recognized one of them. A branch tied with a strip of cloth, my cloth. A piece torn from the corner of my tent bag. I hadn't lost it. Someone had taken it. I panicked. I turned and pushed in another direction, stumbling through brush, branches tearing at my clothes. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just wanted out. The forest closed in around me, every sound amplified. The beat of wings, the crash of something small in the undergrowth. But beneath it all, steady and patient, came the sound I feared most. Footsteps. I ran. My lungs burned, my legs heavy, but I didn't stop. Branches whipped my face, roots caught my boots, but the thought of stopping, of letting whoever it was catch up, was worse. I don't know how long I ran before I broke through onto the dirt road. My knees buckled with relief when I saw my car sitting there. Dust-covered but solid, a piece of safety in the wilderness. I yanked the door open, threw my pack inside, and slammed the lock down. My chest heaved, sweat dripping into my eyes. The road stretched empty in both directions. I looked into the trees one last time, half expecting to see him step out. But there was nothing. I started the engine with shaking hands and drove. I didn't stop until the forest was miles behind me, until the road widened and I saw other cars, other people. Only then did I let myself breathe. I never went back for the rest of that trip. I never camped alone again. The memory still crawls under my skin. The sound of slow footsteps in the dark, circling, waiting. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. All I know is that someone followed me miles into the woods, watched me for days, and never showed themselves. And the part that haunts me most isn't that they were there. It's that they didn't try to take anything, didn't try to attack me outright. They just watched. Patient, silent, waiting for something I never stayed long enough to find out. I had been planning the trip for weeks, and by the time I finally set off, it felt like I had already been living inside the woods in my head. I wanted a break from the noise of the city, from the constant ringing of phones, the cars, the mess of work and people. I thought a few days alone in the wilderness would help clear me out, make me feel alive again. I packed carefully, maybe too carefully, double-checking gear and food supplies. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, extra fuel, headlamp, compass, knife, first aid kit, rope, tarps. I even wrote lists so I wouldn't miss anything. The trail I chose wasn't popular. That was the point. I wanted quiet, no other tents, no loud music playing from portable speakers. The area had no cell service either. And while that made me uneasy, it also made me feel like I would finally get the isolation I thought I needed. The forest out there was thick pine and fir. Long stretches of tangled undergrowth where the light barely touched the ground. Streams ran cold and clear, and in the evenings the air smelled damp and sharp, carrying the sound of crickets and distant water. By the time I reached the spot I had picked on the map, I was sweating hard, my back stiff from the pack. The clearing wasn't big, just a flat patch near a narrow stream with enough room for a tent and fire pit. It felt cut off from the world. No sound of traffic, no voices, not even the faint hum of power lines. Just woods pressing in from every direction. I set up the tent slowly, trying to do everything neat so it would last the few nights I was staying. Pegs went deep, ropes stretched tight. I boiled water and made a simple meal, then sat on a log with my plate balanced on my knees, listening to the wind sift through the trees. The first night was fine, uneventful. I heard an owl, maybe a branch crack under the weight of a deer, but nothing unusual. The ground was firm, the air a little cold, but my sleeping bag held in the warmth. I woke once to roll over and stared through the mesh of the tent at the silhouettes of the trees. They looked frozen in place, black shapes that didn't move even though I could hear the wind. It was eerie, but I told myself that was just the kind of thoughts you get when you camp alone. The second day I hiked further into the woods with only a small pack, just water and snacks. I followed the stream until it narrowed into rocks and then cut back uphill through thick brush. The woods felt endless. It's strange how even a short walk in a place like that can make you feel swallowed, like the world outside doesn't exist anymore. The air felt cooler under the canopy. I saw claw marks on a tree once, deep scratches in the bark, probably a bear. My stomach tightened when I noticed them. I kept glancing around, listening harder than before, trying not to think about how far I was from camp. By late afternoon, I circled back, but I couldn't find the same trail I thought I had taken. I cut across a hill, then another, trying to follow the stream again, but it forked into smaller branches I hadn't noticed earlier. For a while, I didn't admit I was lost. I just kept moving, telling myself I'd recognize something soon. The sun had dipped lower, and light no longer reached the forest floor in more than thin patches. I felt myself sweating even though the air had cooled. When I finally stumbled onto the clearing with my tent again, it was almost dark. Relief washed over me so hard my knees went weak. I dropped my pack and just stood there breathing heavy, staring at the familiar shape of the tent like it was the only solid thing in the world. That night, though, I couldn't shake the unease. Getting lost even for a couple hours had left me rattled. I barely ate. I sat close to the fire, staring into the woods, trying not to listen for things. The sounds grew sharper in my ears. A branch snapping far off, something rustling in the brush. I told myself it was small animals, raccoons or porcupines. But then I thought of the claw marks on the tree. My stomach felt like a knot. I moved my gear into the tent and zipped it up tight. Lying there, I could hear my own heartbeat. Every tiny noise outside pressed in like a weight. I hardly slept. The third day, I decided to stay close to camp. No wandering far, no exploring. I collected wood, filled water bottles from the stream, checked my gear again and again. I told myself the point of being here was to relax, not push deeper into the forest. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't constant, more like waves of awareness that washed over me when I least expected. I'd be bent over tying rope, then suddenly feel my back prickle like eyes were on it. Each time I spun around, there was nothing but trees. By late afternoon, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. Across the stream, about 30 yards out, the undergrowth looked bent, trampled down in a way I hadn't seen before. It wasn't natural. It looked like something heavy had pushed through recently. The leaves still seemed fresh, not dried out. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for movement, but nothing stirred. Still, I couldn't stop staring at that spot. That night was worse. I forced myself to eat, but every bite tasted like sawdust. I built the fire higher than usual, telling myself it would keep animals away. Lying in the tent, the fire glow flickering outside, I tried to steady my breathing. Then I heard it. A slow, steady sound like someone stepping carefully on damp ground. Not close, but not far either. I froze in place, every muscle locked. It stopped. Then a twig cracked. My throat felt dry. I stayed like that for hours, ears straining, barely blinking. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under, but it was shallow, restless sleep. I woke before dawn, stiff and sore, and the fire had burned to ash. I stepped out of the tent, and that's when I saw it. In the soft dirt just beyond the fire pit, a footprint. Not mine, not boot tread, not a hiking shoe. Bare. The toes clear, the heel pressed deep. I stared at it for a long time, my mouth open, my breath thin. Someone had been standing just outside the glow of the fire while I lay inside the tent. For a long time, I couldn't think straight. My first instinct was to pack up and leave, but the trail back was long, and part of me feared running into whoever it was on the way. Another part of me thought maybe it was nothing, maybe just an old print, though deep down I knew better. It was fresh, The edges were sharp, the soil still damp inside. I kept circling back to that thought no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. The rest of the day I barely moved. I sat near the fire pit with my knife in my hand, watching the tree line. The woods felt different now, hostile, like they weren't just trees anymore but walls hiding something. I kept replaying the sound from last night, that careful stepping, and wondering how long they had been there, how close they had come before I woke. By nightfall, I couldn't take it. I stuffed my pack as quickly as I could, not caring about neatness, just jamming everything inside. I told myself I'd hike through the night if I had to, get back to the car and drive until I saw lights and people again. But as I shouldered the pack, I froze. Across the stream, near that same bent undergrowth, a figure stood, still, watching. I couldn't see the face, only the shape, tall, thin, motionless among the trees. For what felt like minutes, neither of us moved. Then slowly the figure stepped back into the shadows until it was gone. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack, doused the fire with water, and bolted down the trail. My legs moved fast, my chest burning with each breath, but the forest felt endless, the path twisting in the dark. My headlamp cut a narrow tunnel of light, the rest black around me. Every few minutes I swore I heard something behind me. The snap of a branch, the shuffle of steps matching my pace. My throat hurt from breathing so hard, but I didn't stop. Hours passed like that, one step after another, until my knees trembled and sweat soaked through my shirt. Then finally, through the trees, I saw the faint silver glint of metal. My car. Relief hit so hard I nearly cried. I sprinted the last stretch, fumbling for the keys, throwing my pack into the back seat without looking. I started the engine and tore down the dirt road, not daring to check the mirrors until I hit the main road miles later. When I finally stopped at a gas station, under the glow of fluorescent lights, I sat gripping the wheel, shaking all over. My clothes were damp, my throat raw, my mind running in circles. I kept thinking of that footprint by the fire pit. Kept thinking of the figure standing across the stream, silent and patient. I never went back for the rest of my gear. I didn't report it. What would I even say? There had been no words, no threats. Just the silent proof that someone else had been there, close enough to watch me while I slept. That was enough. Even now, when I close my eyes, I see the trees standing still in the dark, and I wonder how long that person had been out there before I noticed. Watching, waiting. I had been planning the camping trip for weeks. Nothing special about it, just something to get out of the house and clear my head. I had bought a new tent, packed enough food to last a couple of days, and loaded the car with everything I thought I would need. The idea was simple. Drive out to a quiet stretch of land near the woods, pitch the tent, and stay alone for 2 nights. It was supposed to be calm, something to remind me of how good silence felt. The drive itself wasn't long, maybe 2 hours, but the road that led me to the forest got smaller and rougher as I went deeper. By the time I reached the trailhead, the road had turned into a narrow path of gravel with weeds pushing up through the cracks. There wasn't anyone else parked there. No hikers, no campers, no noise of people. Just my car sitting in the middle of nowhere, and a long trail that bent into the trees like a tunnel. I left the car locked behind me and began walking. The first stretch was easy. The path was wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, and the sun was still above the trees, pouring through the gaps. My bag felt heavy, but that was expected. Every step farther from the car, though, made me feel a little smaller. The forest had a way of swallowing sound. My boots on the dirt seemed loud, but the echoes didn't travel. The deeper I went, the more it felt like the trees wanted to muffle me. I stopped after about an hour of walking and found a small clearing by a slope. There was a flat patch of grass, a few stones that looked good for sitting, and a view of the trees dropping into a valley. I set my bag down, took a breath, and started to set up the tent. It took me longer than I wanted. My hands shook a little from the effort and the quiet pressing down on me, but eventually the tent stood upright. By the time I had finished, the light was turning softer, and the air felt cooler. I made a small fire using dry branches and cooked one of the packets I had brought. The food wasn't good, but the smell of smoke and the crackle of flames gave me comfort. I sat by the fire until it was fully dark. staring into it as if it was the only thing keeping me in place. When I finally crawled into the tent, I felt drained. The forest around me was completely black except for the dim orange glow that leaked from the dying fire. The night was strange. I thought I would fall asleep quickly, but my body didn't let me. I lay there staring at the ceiling of the tent, hearing sounds that didn't belong to me. Small cracks in the brush, branches snapping, leaves shifting. At first I told myself it was animals. Raccoons, deer, something normal. But the longer it went on, the more I noticed a rhythm to it. Something moving, pausing, then moving again. Always in the distance, never close enough to be certain. I forced my eyes shut and stayed still until sleep finally came. When I woke, the fire was cold and the air felt damp. My back hurt from the ground and the tent was filled with that stale smell of fabric and sweat. I stepped outside and stretched, trying to convince myself the night had just been my mind playing tricks. The clearing looked normal in the daylight. Birds called out, the trees moved gently, and nothing seemed threatening. I made coffee with a small camping stove and sat with the mug in my hands, looking at the slope below. It wasn't until I packed my bag to hike farther that I noticed something odd. Near the edge of the clearing, where the grass turned into brush, there were impressions in the dirt. At first they looked like animal prints, but the closer I leaned in, the less they looked that way. They weren't paw prints, not exactly. They were wider, flatter, like the heel of a boot pressed lightly into the ground. I stood there staring at them longer than I should have, trying to decide if I was imagining it. I didn't want to dwell on it, so I pushed the thought away and hiked farther down the valley. The trail grew thinner and harder to follow. Branches whipped against my arms, and I had to use both hands to move through thick brush. I didn't see anyone else. No tents, no people, not even trash left behind. It was as if no one had been there in weeks. By late afternoon, I turned back toward camp. The air felt heavier, as though rain might come. I walked quicker, trying to beat the weather, and reached the clearing just as the first drops started to fall. I got into the tent, zipped it shut, and listened as the rain tapped harder against the fabric. The sound was steady and constant, but somewhere under it I kept hearing something else. A scrape, a crunch like weight on wet soil. Every time I thought I was sure the rain would drown it out. Night came again, and with it came the unease. I had kept the fire smaller this time, worried the rain would kill it too quickly, but even so I could see its faint light flicker against the sides of the tent. I tried to sleep, but the noises outside wouldn't stop. Twigs breaking, leaves shifting. At one point I thought I heard the sound of fabric moving, like something brushing against the side of my tent. My heart pounded and I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag. When morning came, I stepped outside to check. The ground was soft from the rain, and in the mud right near the fire pit there was a clear footprint. Not an animal, a boot. The heel, the tread, everything. Someone had been standing there while I was inside the tent. I stared at it, my stomach tightening. It wasn't mine. The size looked different, a little larger, and I knew I hadn't stepped there. I felt exposed, like the trees around me were hiding someone just out of sight. My first thought was to pack everything and leave, but the trail back was long, and part of me wanted to believe it was just an old print, something left behind days ago. I forced myself to stay calm and told myself I would leave the next morning. The day crawled by. I barely ate. I walked small circles around the clearing, trying to keep my nerves from snapping. Every sound made me twitch. I noticed little things I hadn't before. The way branches bent lower in some spots as if someone had pushed through. The way certain patches of grass were flattened. It all felt like signs, though I couldn't be sure if my mind was twisting them into something worse. When darkness came again, I didn't make a fire. I thought if someone was out there, the light would only give me away. I sat in the tent with everything zipped up, my flashlight in my hand, listening. The night dragged, each hour stretching longer than the one before. The noises outside didn't stop. At one point I was sure I heard breathing close to the tent, soft but steady. My chest tightened so much it hurt, and I clenched the flashlight until my hand went numb. Sometime deep in the night I heard the sound of fabric again, a slow drag along the outside of the tent wall. I held my breath, frozen in place, eyes wide open though I couldn't see anything. The sound circled halfway around before it stopped. Silence pressed against me, thicker than the dark. I don't know if I slept or just blacked out, but when I opened my eyes, the sky was gray, and the air smelled damp again. I didn't waste time. I shoved everything into my bag, barely folding the tent, and started back up the trail. My steps were fast and uneven, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to see my car again. The forest felt different now. It wasn't quiet in a peaceful way anymore. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel watched. Every few steps I looked over my shoulder. More than once I thought I saw something shift between the trees, but every time I stopped there was nothing. The trail seemed longer going back. My legs burned and sweat clung to me despite the cool air. I forced myself not to stop until finally, through the trees, I saw the pale shape of my car. Relief flooded me, but it lasted only a second. The car door was open. I froze where I stood, staring at it. I knew I had locked it. The driver's door hung wide, and the inside looked darker than it should have. My breath shook as I inched closer, each step heavy. The closer I got, the clearer it was. The things from my glove box were scattered across the seat. Papers, a map, my small knife. Someone had gone through it. I didn't stop to think. I threw my bag into the car, slammed the door shut, and started the engine with hands that shook so badly the keys nearly slipped. The sound of the engine filled the silence, and for the first time in days I felt something familiar, something safe. I reversed out of the trailhead as fast as I could and didn't look back. The drive home blurred. My eyes flicked constantly to the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following, but the road stayed empty. By the time I reached my house, my body felt drained, like I had been holding my breath for hours. I carried the bag inside and dropped it on the floor. For the first time in 2 nights, I felt walls around me, locks on doors, light where I wanted it. But even as I sat there telling myself I was safe, one thought wouldn't leave me. Whoever had been out there in the woods hadn't tried to take anything. They hadn't attacked. They had just watched. They had stood at the edge of my fire, circled my tent, opened my car. They wanted me to know they had been there and they had let me leave. That night, lying in my own bed, I realized the silence of the woods wasn't what I'd remember most. It was the sound of footsteps that always stopped just before I could be sure they were there. I always liked the idea of being out in the woods, far from everything that felt heavy in life. The thought of quiet air, the stillness of tall trees, and the sound of water somewhere in the distance seemed like the perfect way to reset my mind. I had done smaller hikes and single-night camps before, but this time I wanted to push it a little further. A long weekend alone, away from roads, away from houses, away from the weight of normal days. It was early autumn when I decided to go. The leaves were just beginning to shift, scattered spots of orange and yellow breaking up the green canopy. The air had that faint chill at night, sharp enough to remind you that summer was gone but not yet biting enough to feel unbearable. The weather forecast said clear skies and calm nights. That felt like a good enough reason to commit. I packed my gear carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, small stove, food for 3 days, water filter, first aid kit, extra socks, a knife, a hatchet, and a map of the area I'd chosen. I double-checked everything twice. I didn't want to be that person who went in unprepared. The area was a state forest I had been to once before, but only on the edge of it. This time I planned to hike deeper in, follow an old logging trail, and set up camp somewhere near a river that bent through the middle. It was a long drive out there, followed by miles of walking, but that was exactly what I wanted. The more distance between me and anyone else, the better. The trail itself was quiet. The first few miles were wide and easy to follow, packed dirt with faint ruts from where trucks must have driven decades ago. It narrowed as I went deeper, choked by brush and fallen branches. I noticed the silence most of all. Even when the wind moved, the trees only whispered lightly. I didn't hear many birds either, which felt strange at first, but I told myself that maybe the season had changed their patterns. By late afternoon, I found a good spot for camp. A clearing maybe 20 feet across with enough flat ground to pitch the tent. A line of thick trees guarded one side, and beyond them I could hear the steady movement of the river. The sound of water always made me feel safer. It felt like something steady, a constant reminder that the world was still moving as it should. I set up camp with care. Tent staked down, sleeping bag unrolled inside, food bag hung from a tree branch well away from where I would sleep. I gathered wood for a small fire, not much, just enough to make the place feel alive when the dark came. When the sun finally dipped low, I sat by the fire and ate from a freeze-dried meal pouch. The taste wasn't much, but the warmth filled me. The first night passed without trouble. I woke up a few times at faint noises, the kind that always carry in the woods, branches snapping, something shifting in the brush. But that's normal. Animals move. Trees settle. I told myself that and went back to sleep each time. The second day I spent exploring. I followed the river downstream, walking carefully along the bank. The water was shallow but fast in places, white foam breaking over smooth stones. I filled my bottle with filtered water and sat for a while, letting the cold air and rushing sound soak into me. When I finally headed back, the sun was sliding toward the treetops. That night, though, the woods didn't feel the same. It began with the quiet. Not the normal stillness of nature, but something heavier. A lack. As I sat by the fire, I realized I couldn't hear the river anymore, even though it was only a short walk away. My ears strained for it, but the sound seemed smothered. I tried to shake it off, telling myself the wind direction could play tricks, or maybe I was just imagining things. But the longer I sat, the more it pressed on me. Later, when I crawled into the tent, I kept the fire low outside, a faint glow through the thin fabric. I lay in my bag, staring upward at the ceiling of nylon, listening. For a while there was nothing. Then, faint but sharp, I heard it. Footsteps. Not the scurry of an animal. Not the four-legged shuffle of a deer. These were heavier, deliberate. 2 beats, a pause. Another 2, I froze in place. My breathing went shallow without me meaning it to. The steps stopped not far from the tent. I didn't move. The silence that followed stretched so long it made my muscles ache from staying tense. Finally, I heard the steps again, this time moving away, fading into the trees. I stayed awake for hours after that. I told myself it could have been another hiker, someone wandering late, maybe out hunting. But it didn't feel like that. The steps had come too close, too quiet until they wanted to be heard. Morning light didn't bring relief. If anything, it made the unease worse. I stepped out of the tent and saw impressions in the dirt near the fire pit. Not boots exactly, but close enough. The soil was soft and the marks weren't sharp, but they were too big to be any animal around here. They looked like the shape of worn shoes pressed deep into the ground. I thought about packing up right then, going home early. But pride has a strange way of digging in. I told myself I was fine, that maybe it had been someone passing through, that they were gone now. I pushed the thought down and decided to stay, at least one more night. I spent most of that day uneasy, though. Every sound pulled at me. Every movement in the trees caught my eye. I tried fishing at the river to distract myself, but my hands shook too much to tie the line properly. By the time the sun dipped low again, I already knew sleep wouldn't come easy. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they circled. I lay flat, trying not to breathe too loud as I heard them slowly moving around the tent. Leaves crushed under weight, one after another. Deliberate, careful, always keeping distance but never leaving. The fire had burned low again, casting only a weak orange glow that barely cut through the tent walls. I thought about unzipping the flap, shining my light out, but fear held me. The thought of seeing someone standing there staring in froze my hand. I gripped the knife I kept by my sleeping bag, but I didn't move. Hours passed like that. At some point, exhaustion dragged me under despite everything. When I woke at dawn, I saw more prints. Dozens this time. The ground around my camp looked disturbed, as if someone had walked circles over and over through the night. That broke me. I packed up fast, stuffing gear into my bag without care. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone step out of the trees. My chest tightened with every minute. The hike out felt endless. The trail twisted, and every bend made me think someone was waiting just beyond it. My pack felt heavier than it should have, each step dragging slower. I didn't stop to eat, didn't stop to rest. I just pushed forward, desperate for the line where woods gave way to road. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, the sight of my car sitting alone in the dirt lot nearly dropped me to my knees. I threw my bag in the back and climbed in, hands shaking so badly I fumbled the keys twice before I got the engine started. As I pulled away, I caught sight of something in the rearview mirror. A figure, standing at the tree line, not moving, not following, just watching. The distance made it impossible to see details. Only the shape of a person, tall and still. I drove until the trees fell away and the road opened wide, and only then did my breathing slow. I never went back. I told myself it was random, just some stranger passing through, maybe curious, maybe strange, maybe worse. But I knew one thing clear: the woods weren't empty. And when you're alone out there, nothing feels more dangerous than realizing someone else has been waiting in the dark the whole time. I wanted to get away for a few days. Life had been heavy, and I thought maybe the quiet of the woods would clear my head. I wasn't new to camping, but I wasn't some survival expert either. I had the basics down: tent, sleeping bag, small stove, some food, a water filter, and a map. I picked a random spot from an online forum where people shared lesser-known camping areas. The post about this one said it was quiet, overlooked by most travelers, and about 2 miles off the main trail. That sounded perfect to me. I parked my car at the trailhead, slung my pack on my back, and started walking in. The first stretch was familiar enough. Worn trail, tall trees, and the smell of pine mixed with dirt. The weather was good. A late summer afternoon, warm but not hot, with a soft breeze that carried the sound of leaves rubbing together high above. I felt good as I hiked in. I thought maybe I'd finally made the right decision to spend time alone instead of sitting at home, trying to block out my own thoughts. After about an hour, the trail narrowed and started to climb. I checked the map a few times to make sure I was on the right side path that would lead toward the marked quiet clearing the forum post had mentioned. The clearing was supposed to be near a small creek. I didn't see anyone else on the trail, which was what I wanted. Still, there was something about the silence that felt heavier the deeper I went. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun had dropped lower. The light had gone from bright gold to a pale orange that stretched long shadows across the ground. The clearing itself was nice. Flat, soft ground covered in grass and pine needles, and the creek only about 50 feet away. It wasn't wide, but it ran steady, the water dark and cold, making a low rushing sound that filled the space. I dropped my pack and set up camp. The tent went up fine, though the ground was a bit rooty in places. I picked a spot near the edge of the clearing so I could face the creek. I set my small stove on a flat rock and heated up a simple meal. While I ate, I kept listening to the forest. At first, it was the usual sounds. Crickets, a few birds still calling, the occasional crack of a branch dropping somewhere. But as it grew darker, I noticed long gaps of silence where nothing moved. Then the sounds would pick up again. I tried not to think too much about it. Animals go quiet sometimes when larger animals are moving. It was normal. Still, I caught myself glancing at the tree line more often than I wanted to admit. The trees seemed to crowd close around the clearing. The shadows between them deepened fast, and soon it felt like I was sitting in the only lit-up circle while everything outside pressed in. When full dark came, I lit a small fire. The warmth helped, but I didn't like how the fire made it harder to see past the glow. Beyond the edge of light, everything was black. I kept turning my head, listening, trying to tell if something was out there. A couple of times I thought I heard faint steps, but the creek made it hard to know for sure. I stayed up later than I planned, poking at the fire, stretching the last of the light. When I finally got into my tent, I zipped it tight and lay still, waiting for my breathing to slow. The ground was colder than I expected, and I shifted a lot before I found a comfortable position. The sound of the creek was steady, but underneath it I thought I heard movement. A soft crunch now and then, like weight pressing on leaves. I told myself it was probably deer. Still, I kept my knife within reach inside the tent. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I started to drift, a noise outside would jolt me awake again. It went on like that most of the night, half asleep, half listening. My mind filling the dark with things I couldn't see. When morning finally came, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. My body was stiff and my head ached. The forest looked harmless in the daylight. The clearing was calm, the creek shining with sun, birds moving through the branches again. It almost made me laugh at how tense I'd been. I ate a quick breakfast and thought about hiking further, maybe exploring past the creek, but I decided against it. I told myself I wanted to relax, but really I didn't want to wander too far from camp. Instead, I stayed around the clearing, read a little, and walked along the creek. The water was colder than I expected when I dipped my hand in. I knelt there filling my bottle when I noticed faint impressions in the mud. They were shoe prints, not boots like mine, but sneakers or something lighter. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. I followed them a short distance before they broke off into the grass and vanished. I told myself maybe someone had camped here before. Still, I hadn't seen anyone on the way in, and this spot was supposed to be little known. That second night, I tried to settle in earlier. I built another fire, ate, and cleaned up carefully. I didn't want to leave scraps that could draw animals. When I crawled into my tent, I left the fire burning low outside. I thought maybe the light would help me sleep, but the noises came again. This time I was sure I heard steps, slow, steady, stopping and starting. At one point, something brushed the side of the tent. My breath caught and I froze. The fabric moved slightly, like a hand or shoulder had grazed it. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. Minutes passed and I didn't hear anything else. I stayed awake until the fire burned out and the cold crept in. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under, but it was a shallow, broken sleep. The next morning, I checked around the tent. Nothing obvious, no tracks I could see in the grass, but I felt it hadn't been my imagination. I thought about leaving then, packing up, hiking back, driving home, but a part of me didn't want to admit fear had chased me out. I convinced myself to stay one more night, telling myself it would be fine if I was careful. The day dragged. I tried to fish in the creek with a line I'd brought, but I couldn't focus. Every snap of a twig pulled my attention. I kept scanning the trees. Sometimes I thought I saw movement, but it was always gone when I looked harder. That night I didn't light a fire. I thought maybe it drew too much attention. I stayed inside the tent as soon as it got dark, lying there in the cold, waiting. The forest pressed heavy with silence. I heard the steps again, closer this time. Grass shifting, a branch creaking, then stillness. I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent slowly and peered out. The moon was bright enough to see shapes, though everything was washed in silver and shadow. At first nothing moved. Then just at the edge of the clearing I saw a figure. Not an animal. A person. They were standing still, half behind a tree, facing my camp. I froze. My mouth went dry and my body felt locked. I stared, trying to see details, but the dark kept their face hidden. They didn't move, just stood there watching. I pulled back into the tent, zipped it, and grabbed my knife. My mind raced. I thought about yelling, about charging out, about running, but I couldn't make myself move. I sat there for what felt like hours, gripping the knife, my ears straining for every sound. At some point, I must have blacked out from exhaustion. When I opened my eyes again, gray light was leaking into the tent. I scrambled out, scanning the clearing. No one was there. The grass was damp with dew and the tree line looked as normal as ever. But I knew what I had seen. I didn't waste time. I packed everything fast, shoving gear into my bag without care. The whole time I felt eyes on me, though I never saw anyone. I slung my pack and started back to the trail. The hike out was the longest of my life. Every sound behind me made me turn. I kept checking over my shoulder, sure I'd see someone following. The trees felt closer, the shadows darker, even though it was broad daylight. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, I almost broke into a run. I yanked the door open, tossed my pack inside, and locked the doors as fast as I could. My hands shook so hard I fumbled the keys. I drove out without looking back. It's been weeks since then, and I still can't shake the image of that figure standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden, unmoving. I keep thinking about the shoe prints by the creek, the brush against the tent, the silence at night. I went camping to clear my head, but now I feel worse. At home, I keep checking my windows. Every time I hear a noise outside, I freeze. I can't stop picturing someone standing just beyond the glass watching, the way they did in the woods. I don't think I was the first person they watched out there. And I don't think I'll be the last. I decided to go camping that weekend because I wanted to get away from everything. My head had been full of noise from work, from people, from the endless routine of being stuck in the same place every day. I thought a trip into the woods, just me and the silence, would clear it all out. I had no plans beyond staying 2 nights, maybe 3 if I felt like it. I loaded my backpack with the basics: tent, sleeping bag, a little stove, food, water filter, knife, flashlight, extra batteries, a compass, and a map of the area. I had been in these woods before, but only during the day, never overnight. I wanted to test myself. The forest was about 3 hours from where I lived. The drive was easy, just a long stretch of road that got narrower the deeper I went. The trees thickened around me, tall and heavy, with the kind of age that makes you feel small. I parked my car at a lot near the trailhead, the last place I'd see pavement until I came back. I hoisted my pack, adjusted the straps, and started walking into the woods. The first mile or so was easy. The trail was wide, soft from years of footsteps, and the late afternoon sun filtered through the trees in patches of gold. I kept my pace steady, listening to the birds above me and the crunch of dry leaves under my boots. There was a calm to it, the kind of calm that makes you feel like maybe you were meant to be in places like this instead of behind a desk. After about 2 hours of hiking, I found a spot that looked good for camp. It was a flat clearing not far from a small stream. I could hear the water trickling over stones, which I knew would be useful. The ground was soft but not muddy, and there were no big roots sticking up where I'd pitched the tent. I set everything up slowly, making sure I did it right. Tent first, then sleeping bag inside, then I set the little stove on a flat rock and boiled some water for a quick meal. As the sun started dipping lower, the woods changed. The warm light disappeared and the shadows stretched out until they covered everything. The sounds changed too. The birds went quiet, replaced by the faint clicks and rustles of things moving through the underbrush. I wasn't scared exactly, but I was alert. I knew animals lived out here and I didn't want to attract them. After I ate, I cleaned everything, sealed up the food, and hung it from a tree branch a little ways from the tent. When the dark finally came, it came hard. The kind of dark where you can't see more than a few feet without a light. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the black like a blade. I walked a short circle around my camp, making sure everything looked fine. Then I settled into the tent. Lying there, listening to the forest at night was different from anything I'd known. Every snap of a twig, every brush of leaves in the wind, every tiny movement made my ears twitch. I told myself it was just animals, raccoons maybe, or squirrels, or even deer. Still, I didn't fall asleep right away. Hours passed before I finally drifted off. I woke up sometime after midnight to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't a twig snap or a rustle. It was heavier. A crunch of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving close to where my tent stood. I froze, my eyes were open, but I didn't move a muscle. The sound came again, another step, then a pause. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might shake the fabric of the tent. I told myself it had to be a deer, maybe even a bear, though the thought of a bear wasn't much better. I reached quietly for my knife, keeping it close in my hand. The steps came closer, then stopped completely. The silence was worse than the sound. I lay there, barely breathing, waiting. Minutes passed, maybe more than that. Finally, the noise faded. The steps moved off, slow at first, then gone. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening, gripping the knife until my hand cramped. When dawn came, I stepped out of the tent. The forest looked different in daylight, almost harmless. I checked the ground around camp, searching for tracks. I found some impressions in the soft soil. At first I thought they might be from a deer, but the shape was wrong. They were boots, human. The prints led from the trees straight toward my tent, then away again. I stared at them for a long time. My stomach twisted. Someone had been out here walking around my camp while I slept. I considered packing up and leaving right then, but I told myself, maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was another camper, just passing through. Still, I had seen no other people on the trail, no signs of anyone nearby. I forced myself to stay. I had come out here for quiet, for space, and I wasn't going to ruin it over one bad night. The day went by without trouble. I hiked further into the woods, carrying only a small bag with water and some snacks. I followed the stream, climbing over rocks, and spent hours just walking. I saw no one. The forest was endless, trees pressing close on every side. The quiet felt heavier than it had the day before. I kept thinking about the footprints. By late afternoon, I returned to camp. Everything looked untouched. I made another meal, cleaned up, and tried to relax. As the sun went down, I built a small fire, more for comfort than anything else. The flames pushed back the dark, crackling softly. I sat there for a while, staring into it, feeling a little safer. When I finally put the fire out and went to bed, I told myself I'd sleep better. But I didn't. Sometime deep into the night, the sounds came back. Footsteps, slow, steady, circling the tent. My skin prickled all over. I lay there, every muscle tight. The steps stopped for a long time, then I heard something new. The sound of fabric brushing. My tent wall shifted slightly, like fingers pressing against it from the outside. I didn't move. Whoever it was stood there, touching the tent, testing it. My breathing was shallow and sweat ran down my face, though the air was cold. Then as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The steps faded back into the woods. At first light, I packed up. My hands shook as I stuffed the sleeping bag into the pack and tore down the tent. I wanted out. I wanted the car, the road, the noise of civilization. But when I reached the trail, something felt wrong. I looked down and saw fresh prints in the dirt. Boot prints again. Only this time they matched my trail. They had been following me. I started walking fast, almost running. The forest pressed in around me and every sound felt too close. The trail twisted, narrowed, and I realized I was moving faster than I could think. My map was in the pack, but I didn't stop to check it. I just kept going. Hours passed and the sun climbed high. I should have reached the lot by then, but I didn't. The trail forked in places I didn't remember, and soon I wasn't sure where I was. My legs burned, my throat was dry, and panic set in. I had gotten turned around. I stopped finally, pulled out the map, tried to match the lines to the land around me. Nothing made sense. My compass needle shook in my hand, but it told me north. I tried to follow it, thinking it would lead me back to the main trail. The woods grew thicker, branches clawing at my clothes, the ground uneven and full of hidden holes. I tripped more than once, scraping my palms on rocks. All the while I felt it, that I wasn't alone, that someone was behind me. I turned again and again, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. When the sun dipped low again, I realized I wasn't going to make it out before dark. My chest tightened. I found a small rise, a patch of ground that was somewhat clear, and I dropped my pack. I didn't bother with the tent this time. I sat with my back against a tree, knife in my lap, flashlight ready. The dark came fast again. I clicked the light on and swept it over the trees. For hours I sat there, straining my ears. Then I saw it. A shape between the trees, just outside the beam. A figure standing still, watching. I froze, light shaking in my hand. The figure didn't move. I blinked and it was gone. The rest of the night was a blur of fear. Footsteps circled me again, staying just out of sight. My mind raced with thoughts. Whoever it was, they weren't lost. They knew these woods better than me. They were waiting me out, driving me deeper in, watching me fall apart. When dawn came, I forced myself to move again. My body was heavy, my eyes burning from lack of sleep. I walked until my legs barely worked, trying to find the trail, the stream, anything familiar. But all I found was more forest. My food was running low, my water nearly gone. By the second night, I knew I wasn't getting out alone. I stayed awake again, clutching the knife, listening to the endless sounds of someone moving where I couldn't see. Every time I thought I'd imagined it, a twig snapped or leaves shifted. They were still out there. The third day, I stumbled onto something that made my stomach turn. A campsite. Not mine, not recent. Old. A torn tent, shredded sleeping bag, rusted stove, and scattered trash half buried in dirt. It looked abandoned for years. But the prints around it were fresh. Boot prints. That's when I understood. Whoever was out here wasn't lost. They lived here. They stayed in the woods waiting for people like me. And I had wandered right into their ground. I didn't stop to think. I ran, crashing through brush, branches tearing at me, lungs burning. I ran until my legs gave out, until I collapsed in a clearing. When I lifted my head, I saw something through the trees. A glint, metal. I dragged myself forward and saw the road. The edge of the parking lot, my car still there, waiting. Relief flooded me so hard I could barely stand. I stumbled across the pavement, threw myself inside, locked the doors, and had been planning the camping trip for weeks, mostly because I needed to get away from the noise of my everyday life. I wanted quiet, nothing but the sound of trees moving in the wind and water rushing in a nearby stream. I had gone camping before, but always with friends. This time I decided to go alone, thinking it would clear my head, give me time to breathe. I picked a place far away from the common spots people usually went. It wasn't part of the main campground where families brought kids and grilled food in the open. I wanted real quiet, so I looked at maps, checked satellite images online, and found a small stretch of woods beside a lake that looked untouched. There were no marked trails to it, but I figured if I parked near the dirt road and walked a few miles in, I could set up a tent there without anyone bothering me. The day I left, the sky was clear and the air smelled sharp, like fall was coming soon. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, some food, a hatchet, flashlight, and a knife I always carried on trips. Nothing fancy. I brought water, but also a filter in case I needed to drink from the lake. I left my phone on airplane mode because there was no signal out there anyway, but I kept it with me for the clock and flashlight backup. When I parked on the dirt road, it was empty. No tire tracks ahead of mine, no sign anyone had been there for days. I pulled my pack on and started walking into the woods. At first it was peaceful. Birds shifted branches above me. The ground was soft with pine needles and the air felt cooler the deeper I went in. I followed a game trail, probably used by deer, until I reached the edge of the lake. The water was still and dark, ringed by thick trees that grew right up to the shore. I found a spot where the ground flattened out and set up my tent. The view of the water was perfect, and it felt hidden enough that I doubted anyone would wander close. It was late afternoon by the time I finished, and I built a small fire pit with rocks, laying down some kindling I had collected on the way. The evening went quiet in a way I wasn't used to. In the city, even at night, there are cars, voices, sirens in the distance. Out there, when the sun dropped behind the trees, the silence pressed in hard. I roasted some food over the fire and watched the last bit of daylight slip away. The stars came out sharp, brighter than I had seen in a long time, and the reflection of them in the lake almost looked like another sky. At first, I felt calm. I told myself this was exactly what I wanted. No people, no noise, no stress. Just me in the woods. I sat by the fire until the wood burned down to glowing red, then crawled into the tent and zipped it shut. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The fire outside had burned out, and the inside of the tent was black. My ears rang with silence, except it wasn't silence. It was a low sound, distant, almost like a branch dragging against the ground. I held my breath and listened. The noise came again, faint but there, a long scrape, then a pause. I thought maybe it was an animal, a deer moving close to the tent. My heart was beating faster, but I tried to calm down. I told myself animals walked at night all the time. I rolled over and closed my eyes, forcing myself not to panic. I must have dozed off again because the next thing I knew, pale light was leaking through the tent. Morning. When I stepped outside, the ground was wet with dew. I stretched, breathed in the cold air, and tried to shake off the unease from the night. That's when I noticed something strange. Near the fire pit, the dirt looked disturbed. I remembered how I had left it, flat with some ashes still glowing faintly. But now there were lines in the dirt, almost like something had been dragged across it. They weren't paw prints. They weren't boot prints either. Just shallow lines, curved and broken, moving toward the woods. I crouched down, staring at them. They looked almost like someone had taken a stick and drawn lazy circles, but uneven. Like whatever made them wasn't trying to draw, but just left marks by accident. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal with an odd gait or something had dragged a branch, but it didn't look natural. I pushed the thought away, cooked some breakfast, and spent the morning exploring the shoreline. I found a fallen log and sat on it, watching the water. The longer I sat there, the more I noticed how still everything was. No fish breaking the surface, no birds flying overhead, just the trees and the dark water. By afternoon, I felt restless. I hiked deeper into the woods behind my camp, carrying only my knife and some water. The ground was uneven, full of thick roots and fallen branches. But after about an hour, I came across what looked like an old path. The trees bent over it, and the ground had a groove like it had once been used a lot but hadn't seen travel in years. I followed it. The path twisted and narrowed until it opened into a small clearing. In the center of it was something that froze me in place. An old fire ring, stones stacked in a circle, black with soot that looked long cold. Beside it, a log had been cut flat, probably used as a seat. The clearing was empty otherwise, but the air felt heavier there. I walked over to the stones and crouched. They were coated in moss, but underneath the black marks were obvious. I touched one and it crumbled slightly under my fingers, like it hadn't been touched in a long time. But what unsettled me more was what I found a few feet away. A rope, frayed and sun-bleached, tied around a tree. The end of it hung loose, swinging a little in the breeze. It wasn't new, but it wasn't rotted through either. I stared at it for a long time, wondering who had left it there and why. The silence in that clearing felt different from the quiet back at the lake. It wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. I backed away, suddenly aware of how far I had come from camp. My skin prickled and I couldn't shake the idea that I wasn't supposed to be standing there. I hurried back, checking behind me more than once, even though nothing moved. By the time I reached my tent again, the sun was dipping low. I built up my fire and sat close, trying to get the images of the rope and the empty fire ring out of my head. When night came, I lay awake longer than before. The forest seemed louder somehow, creaking with small noises I couldn't place. My ears caught every shift, every rustle. Then came the scraping again. It was closer this time. A slow, deliberate drag across the ground, stopping, then starting again. My chest tightened and I reached for my knife in the dark, gripping the handle so hard my fingers hurt. The sound circled the tent, one side then the other. I held my breath, afraid even the sound of my lungs would give me away. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, then silence. Long, stretched silence. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under. But when I opened my eyes again, daylight was cutting through the fabric of the tent. When I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. The ground around the tent was marked. Not footprints, just more of those dragging lines, cutting shallow trails in wide arcs. They overlapped, circling the tent in uneven loops. My throat felt dry and I couldn't stop looking at them. Whatever it was, it hadn't just passed by. It had lingered. It had circled me while I was inside, gripping my knife, too afraid to move. I told myself I should pack up and leave. But a part of me wanted to know. Curiosity, maybe, or pride that didn't want to admit I was scared. I stayed. That day I barely left camp. I sat near the fire, staring at the tree line, listening. The woods stayed quiet, too quiet, like even the animals were avoiding the place. Every shadow looked like movement. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. When night came again, I built the biggest fire I could. I sat awake, staring at the flames, my knife resting on my knee. Hours passed and my eyes grew heavy. Just when I thought maybe nothing would happen, I heard it again. Not a scrape this time. A snap. A branch breaking in the dark. I froze, staring into the trees. The fire threw light, but beyond a few feet it was only blackness. The sound came again, another snap, closer. I gripped the knife tighter. My mouth felt dry as sand. The fire cracked, and for a second I thought I saw something move just beyond the glow. A shadow, tall and thin, slipping between the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. I stayed up the rest of the night, staring at the woods, waiting for another sound. Morning came slow, and when the sun finally broke, I knew I couldn't stay. I packed up fast, stuffing everything into my bag with shaking hands. But when I turned to take down the tent, I froze. On the far side of the camp, near the edge of the trees, the ground was disturbed again. Not just lines this time. Something had been kneeling there. The earth was pressed down, smooth in the shape of two knees. Whoever it was had been crouching, watching me. My skin crawled, and I ripped the tent down without folding it, shoving it into my pack. I didn't bother covering the fire pit or checking the lake. I just slung the bag over my shoulders and left. The hike back felt endless. Every snap of a branch behind me made me spin around. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I would see someone following, slipping through the trees. But each time there was nothing. Just empty woods, quiet and endless. When I finally reached the dirt road and saw my car, my chest nearly collapsed with relief. I threw the pack inside, slammed the door, and started the engine with shaking hands. I remember the exact moment I stepped out of my truck and breathed in the air of the woods that evening. It was thick with the smell of pine, damp earth, and the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. The gravel crunched under my boots, and for a brief second the world felt quiet and simple. I had chosen this spot at random on a map, thinking it would be a good place to clear my head for a few days. I wasn't looking for adventure, just silence, a stretch of time without my phone, without work, without people. The trailhead had been empty when I pulled up. That should have comforted me, but instead it unsettled me in a way I didn't recognize at first. I kept telling myself that it was good. No people meant no noise, no interruptions. It was what I wanted. I slung my pack over my shoulders, tightened the straps, and started the hike deeper into the trees. The first few miles weren't difficult. The trail was clear, though narrow, with patches of roots snaking across the dirt like old scars. I could hear the occasional bird overhead, the rush of a distant creek, and the constant buzz of insects. Sweat quickly collected on my back and around my collar, sticking the fabric of my shirt to my skin. The light from the late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy in shifting patches, making it hard to judge how far I'd gone or how much daylight I had left. I stopped once, leaning on my knees and sipping from my water bottle. My ears rang in the silence. I realized how far away the world was already. The trailhead was behind me, the road even farther. There was nothing out here but trees, rocks, dirt, and the weight of the forest pressing in from every direction. That realization brought both comfort and unease. By the time I found a decent clearing, the sun had already begun to sink lower. The sky was shifting from pale blue to a washed-out orange that barely filtered through the branches above. I set down my pack, my shoulders sore, my legs heavy, and began the work of setting up camp. The ground was uneven, littered with pine cones and small stones, but I cleared a space as best I could. My tent was small, barely enough room for me and my gear, but it felt like a barrier, a little bubble of safety against the endless dark that would come soon. Once the tent was up, I gathered a pile of sticks and tried to start a fire. It took longer than it should have. My hands were stiff and the wood was damp from recent rain. Sparks hissed and died until finally one caught and the flame grew. I fed it carefully, crouched low, my face warming from the glow. The fire was small, fragile looking compared to the forest around it, but it was mine. The smell of smoke rose into the air, curling upward until it vanished into the black canopy. I ate a simple meal from my pack, nothing special, just fuel to fill the empty feeling in my stomach. Afterward, I sat there for a long while, staring at the fire, letting my thoughts wander. The quiet pressed in harder now. The birds had gone silent. The insects had changed their rhythm. There was a stillness, a waiting kind of silence, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. When night fully came, it was darker than I expected. My fire cast a small circle of orange light, but beyond that, everything was swallowed in black. The trees became silhouettes, their shapes twisting together into one endless wall. I thought about how far from anything I was, how a simple wrong step in the dark could leave me wandering without direction. That thought tightened my chest. I crawled into the tent, zipped it closed, and lay on my back with my sleeping bag pulled tight around me. The ground was cold and uneven, and every sound outside felt amplified. A branch snapping in the distance made my body tense. Leaves rustling seemed closer than they should have been. I told myself it was animals, the usual kind of movement you'd expect out here. Deer, raccoons, maybe a coyote. My mind wanted to believe it, but my body didn't relax. Sometime in the night, I woke up suddenly. My mouth was dry and my heart was racing before I even understood why. I listened. At first, I heard nothing but my own breath, shallow and uneven. Then it came, a sound. Footsteps. Not the quick, erratic movements of an animal, but steady, deliberate crunches of weight pressing into the ground. They were faint, but close enough to make me freeze. I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the fabric of the tent above me. The footsteps stopped, then started again, circling. My skin prickled. I told myself it could be a deer, maybe even a bear, but it didn't feel right. Bears didn't move like that. They didn't stop and start, slow and measured like someone pacing. Minutes passed. My muscles ached from staying rigid. Eventually, the footsteps drifted away, fading into the distance until I couldn't hear them anymore. I told myself it had been nothing, just the forest playing tricks on me. But I didn't sleep much after that. When dawn came, the light was thin and gray. My fire had gone out, leaving only a pile of cold ashes. I stepped outside, stiff from the night, and scanned the clearing. My eyes caught something in the dirt. Tracks, not animal tracks, footprints. They weren't mine. They were longer, wider, pressed deep into the soft earth. They circled the tent in a loose pattern, weaving close and then pulling away again. My stomach twisted. Someone had been here. Someone had walked around my camp while I was inside, pretending to sleep. I packed my things quickly, barely eating. My hands shook as I stuffed the tent into its bag, my eyes darting toward the trees again and again. Every shadow looked like it was hiding something. Every sound in the distance made me flinch. I thought about leaving, about hiking straight back to my truck. But something stubborn in me said I could stick it out. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stupidity. I told myself it was just some stranger passing through. Maybe another hiker curious about my fire. That had to be it. I decided to move camp anyway. I hiked deeper, putting as much distance as I could between myself and that clearing. The trail grew rougher, the brush thicker. Branches clawed at my arms as I pushed through. My boots slipped on loose rocks more than once, and I nearly twisted my ankle on a hidden root. Still, I kept going until the light began to dim again. This time I set up in a tighter space between trees. The ground was damp and the air was cooler, carrying the sharp bite of water. I realized I was close to the creek I had heard yesterday. The constant rush of it drowned out the smaller sounds of the woods, which gave me a strange sense of comfort. I built another fire, smaller this time, and sat with my back against a tree, watching the flames lick the air. But I couldn't shake the thought of those footprints. The way they circled me. The way they had appeared in the night without a sound until the person wanted me to hear them. It wasn't an accident. Whoever it was had wanted me to know they were there. That night was worse. I lay in the tent, my body tired but my mind sharp with unease. I listened harder than I ever had before, straining against the sound of the creek. And then sometime after midnight I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow. Steady. Closer than before. This time, I didn't just hear them. I saw a shadow pass over the thin wall of my tent. My throat tightened. The fire outside had burned low, but it was enough to cast shapes. A figure moved, tall and deliberate, circling once again. I held my breath. My chest ached with the effort. The figure paused inches from where my head rested. I could see the outline of legs, the faint curve of a shoulder. My skin crawled, every nerve screaming to move, to run, to do anything but lie there. But I stayed still. Eventually the shadow drifted away. The footsteps faded. I lay there until the sky lightened again, every second dragging out like an hour. In the morning I didn't hesitate. I packed faster than I thought possible, shoving gear into my pack with no care for order. My chest felt tight, my thoughts racing. I told myself I'd had enough, that I'd cut my trip short and hike back to the truck. But when I reached for the trail, I froze. The path was different. Branches were broken in ways I didn't remember. Piles of stones had been placed along the edges, small stacks that hadn't been there before. I walked faster, my breath quick and uneven. My eyes kept darting behind me, expecting to see someone there, following just out of sight. The deeper I went, the less familiar it felt. Landmarks I thought I remembered were gone. I tried to stay calm, but the truth settled into me like a weight. I was lost. I wandered for hours, the sun climbing high and then falling again. My water ran low. My legs burned with each step. The forest all looked the same, endless trees, endless shadows, and every so often I'd find signs, footprints in the dirt, a strip of cloth caught on a branch, another pile of stones. Whoever was out here, they weren't just passing by. They were leading me, hurting me. By the second night, I was too tired to build a fire. I just crawled into the tent and curled up, shaking, my stomach empty, my mouth dry. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every noise outside felt sharper, closer. At one point, I swore I heard breathing just outside the tent wall. The third day blurred together. I stumbled through the woods, barely aware of direction anymore. My skin was scratched raw from branches, my lips cracked. I found the creek again and drank until my stomach hurt, but it didn't help the hollow ache inside me. That night, I didn't even bother with the tent. I collapsed against a tree, my pack still on, and tried to stay awake. My head kept dipping, though, and